Welcome back to Warhammer. We got a quick announcement. We got a Discord server that I'm gonna be more active in. Be sure to join. You'll be able to talk to me, give me suggestions, all the good stuff. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, because the support goes a long way. Now, let's get into the video.
The shrine world of Valith had almost slipped from the memory of the wider Imperium. It turned in the cold dark of the Segmentum Obscurus, shrouded in dust and the faint halo of its own faith signature, a low murmur in the Empyrean compared to the howling beacon of greater pilgrim hubs. Its hives were not the howling industrial stacks of a forge world, nor the regiment factories of a guard foundry planet. They were cathedra, ossuaries, reliquary towers. Whole hive spires had been hollowed into vaults of bone and stone, stacked with the dead of uncounted generations, all dedicated to a saint whose true name had been lost centuries ago. The Veiled One, some called him, the Unburned, the Keeper of Lights. The titles had multiplied as the millennia crawled on, each new generation adding another layer of story. The original cult, laid down in the age of the Great Crusade, had been precise and narrow, codified in hard script, and sanctioned by iterators long turned to dust. That had been before the burning of worlds, before the betrayal of the legions, before the saint's name had been scraped from every stable record by order of the throne. In the absence of truth, stories bred like vermin. Now the saint's statues loomed from every terrace and avenue, hooded stone faces lifted toward the hazed sun, arms outstretched to receive votive candles and rag banners. Their features changed subtly from district to district, sculptors laying their own understanding upon the stone. In one habtier, the saint's lips were soft with sorrow. In another, his mouth was twisted in a faint, knowing smile. In yet another, his teeth showed in a hungry grin. No one noticed how far the faces had drifted from the old reliefs in the sealed archive vaults. Harvan noticed that the eyes seemed deeper than they had in his childhood, but Harvan was only a scribe third class in a minor offshoot of the administratum, and his task was to copy tithe accounts and shrine donations, not to notice the slow warp of a world's faith. He moved with the procession across the bridge of 1,000 lights, clutching his candle cup in both hands. The bridge arced between spires, its span crowded from buttress to buttress with bodies. Robes brushed against him, shoulders knocked him, the press of the faithful carrying him forward step by reluctant step. Lanterns swung from chains overhead, turning the river of pilgrims into a flickering band of red and gold. "Praise to the Veiled One," they chanted, voices ragged but unending. "Praise to his mercy, praise to his endless light." Harvan's own voice was hoarse. The words tasted wrong today, like meat left too long on a hook, but he chanted them anyway. The reliquary was opening. The priesthood had proclaimed it from every pulpit tower. A great unlocking of the inner vaults, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to bring offerings to the deepest shrine. To be present on such a day was considered fortune beyond measure. He tried to ignore the way the stone underfoot seemed to thrum faintly, like the distant beat of some buried heart. "Do you feel it?" said the man at his shoulder. Harvan turned his head as much as the crush allowed. The man wore the same cheap shrine red as everyone else, the hood drawn deep. But there was something too still about him. The throng jostled and swayed. This one figure stood as steady as a statue, as if the press of bodies simply broke on him like surf on rock. "Feel what?" Harvan managed. "His attention," the man said. "After so long, the saint remembers his flock." The hood tilted up, as if looking toward the cathedral spires. "And he has found a better use for them than muttered prayers." Harvan swallowed. His throat felt very dry. "Brother, we should not speak of the saint so lightly," he said, glancing at the nearest shrine wardens. They were moving along the edges of the bridge, shock staves resting in their hands, eyes searching for any sign of disorder. They would not be gentle with blasphemers on a day like this. "I do not speak lightly," the hooded man murmured. I speak as one who has heard him." The bridge shuddered. The chant faltered, then rose again, a fresh wave of noise. Harvin looked ahead and saw that the procession was slowing at the far end, bunching up around the great arch that led into the cathedral complex of High Valith Primus. Vox horns mounted along the arch's inner curve crackled to life with a shriek of feedback, then with a voice that drowned the chant as a thunderblast drowns a whisper. "Children of Valith." The words rolled out over the hive, carried on wired vox, on crackling picked casters, on the flickering hollows in every hab and labor stack. Harvin felt them as much as heard them, each syllable pressing against his skin, dragging his mind into attention. "Children of the forgotten saint, you who walk blind beneath his gaze, you who have worn your knees raw upon stone, you who have given your coin, your blood, your sons to the tithe, and never once heard an answer." The voice was not one he recognized. It was deeper than any local cardinal's, layered with a resonance that made the bridge cables hum. In the upper vaults of the great cathedral, far above the sweating press of pilgrims, Dark Apostle Carcharodons smiled inside his horned helm and leaned a little closer to the vox grill before him. The braziers set around the pulpit burned with corpse fat and sacred oils. The smoke coiled in patterns that made mortal minds ache to look upon. The banners that hung from the vault arches were the same shrine colors as ever, but somewhere under the red and gold there were new threads, new sigils, 8-pointed and blasphemous, visible only when the light struck just so. "Your saint has heard you," Carcharodons said, his voice broadcast through every vox shrine, every pulpit, every portable reliquary altar wired into the hive's bone. "He has watched you. He has counted every whispered plea, every fear, every moment you lifted your eyes to his veiled face and begged for respite from the endless grind of your lives." His gauntleted hand traced an idle circle over the open book before him. The pages were old human skin, the letters black with frozen warp fire. The litanies of Lorgar flowed there, now interspersed with newer script in the curling hand of Carcharodons himself. Sermons for a world that had forgotten its first truth. "And he has found you wanting," Carcharodons said. The words struck like a hammer. On the bridge, Harvin staggered as if something had physically blown against him. The crowd stuttered. People turned to each other, eyes wide, mouths open. The shock wardens along the railings looked up, uncertain. This was not the festival sermon they had been briefed on. The hooded man beside Harvin chuckled softly. "There it is," he said. "You labor," the Dark Apostle said, his voice rising, "for masters who do not know your names. You bleed for an emperor who has never once looked your way. You burn your dead and grind their bones into mortar for cathedrals that will never be finished. You think your saint intercedes for you. You think he whispers in the throne's ear." Carcharodons raised his arms. Around him, his chosen word-bearers stood like red statues, their armor carved with scripture and studded with scripture seals. They watched their master with lenses that glowed with inner cinder light. "Children," Carcharodons said, and his voice became a caress of contempt. "Your saint is not at the throne. Your saint is here, in the dark beneath your feet, in the vault where your ancestors locked him away when they still had the courage to fear what he was." He could feel them now, all across the hive. The moment of doubt, the ripple of terror, the first cracks in the crust of their inherited faith. It was delicious. "Today," he said, "we open his tomb. Today you will not beg for scraps from a dead emperor. Today you will step willingly into your saint's embrace, and in your screaming he will be reborn." The chant began then, rising from 1,000 word-bearer throats in hidden chapels and profaned shrines, swelling and echoing as mortal mouths caught the rhythm without understanding. The words were an old Colchizian path litany, bent to a new and bloodier purpose. 8 are the steps, Cortalic intoned. 8 are the wounds. 8 are the gates to the truth beneath the veil. 8 are the steps, came the echo, from hab to hab, from spire to sump. 8 are the wounds. 8 are the gates. On the bridge, Harvin felt his own lips moving, shaping the alien syllables. The candle cup fell from his hands and vanished under trampling feet. The hooded man beside him threw back his cowl and revealed a face tattooed in twisting runes, his eyes alight with warp fire. "Down!" the hooded man whispered, and there was the suggestion of something vast and reptilian in the word, something that coiled around Harvin's spine and squeezed. Down into the reliquary. Down, little brother. Your saint waits to greet you. Deep beneath high Valeth Primus, where the heat of the world's mantle licked at adamantine struts and the stone groaned under the weight of the hive above. Warsmith Damakos Brak watched the hololithic displays update. Lines of stress patterns crawled across the continent-scale schematics. The crustal plates had been bored and braced, the mantle tapped, the hive foundations fused into an iron web that turned the whole structure into a single locked fortress. Shield nodes glimmered as hard points, overlapping fields showing as pale domes over cathedra and reactor cores. Macro cannon silos, their barrels kilometers long, rotated slowly in their armored housings like the stalks of metal flowers. "It will hold," Damaco said. His voice was like ground, stone. Around him, the control nexus thrummed with activity. Iron warriors, thralls in grey, featureless helms, scurried between cogitator banks and control lecterns, relaying data, adjusting algorithms. Servitors were nailed into their alcoves, flesh long since replaced by wire and piston. The air smelled of oil, ozone, and old blood. One of his lieutenants stepped forward, helm reverently unclasped and held at his hip. "Warsmith," the lieutenant said, "the outer void shield lattice is at full overlap. The macro cannon are slave to central control. The Hellforgers report that the last of the hull plates for the orbital bastions will be ready for void transit within 2 shift cycles." Damakos did not look at him. His gaze was locked on the deep strata schematics, on the pulsing mark that indicated the sealed heart of Valeth's reliquary. The machine spirits of the old Imperium were sulking there. He could feel them through the tang of ozone on his tongue, through the faint vibration in the deck. "All this," he said, almost to himself, "for a single vault." "The word-bearer says it is a font," the lieutenant ventured cautiously. "A place where the corpse emperor's own hand once carved the warp, a weapon, or a door." "He says many things," Damakos said. "Most of them are poems." He turned at last, servo arms unfolding behind him with the whine of overtaxed motors, their claw tips dripping machine oil and half-dried sacra. His armor was ancient, patchwork and brutally functional, layered with hazard chevrons and kill tallies etched into the ceramite. Chains hung from his pauldrons, each bearing a broken cog, or an imperial aquila turned upside down. "Poems do not hold against lance batteries," he said. "My work does." Far above, Cortalic's sermon swelled to a crescendo. The eightfold chant pulsed through the hive like the beat of a monstrous heart. Shrine wardens found themselves overcome, dropping shock staves to join the tide instead of resisting it. Gate controls that should have been guarded were left unattended or were manned by pilgrims whose hands shook and eyes rolled white as whispers coiled in their ears. The outer processions, which were meant only to circle the cathedra and return to their habtiers, found new paths opening before them. Maintenance tunnels that should have been sealed irised obediently at their approach, their machine spirits soothed by scrap code demons. Cargo elevators that were never used for civilians descended without challenge into levels marked restricted even on administratum charts. Harvin did not remember leaving the bridge. One moment he was crushed there, the next he was in a wide transit tunnel lit by guttering lumen strips, the crowd around him surging forward in a single irresistible direction. The air grew hotter as they descended. The stone underfoot changed, the smooth devotional paving giving way to older, rougher strata marked with faded litanies in a script no one alive could read. "Where are we going?" Harvin croaked. "Home," the tattooed man said. He had kept pace effortlessly, never jostled, never pushed. To the saint beneath the world. The tunnel opened into a cavern so vast, Harvin's mind could not grasp its full shape. Vaulted ceilings lost themselves in shadow. The floor was a forest of pillars and arches, each carved as a line of hooded saints, backs bowed beneath the weight of the world above. In the center of the space was a depression, a wide basin lined with black stone. It was already half filled with bodies. Some were standing, swaying and murmuring. Others were kneeling or lying flat, arms outstretched. At the lowest point, Harvin saw a slick glimmer in the torchlight and realized that the stone was wet. "Step down," the tattooed man said gently. Harvin tried to resist. His legs did not respond. He was dimly aware of hands at his back, at his sides, guiding him, or pushing him. The eightfold chant rolled over him in waves. The basin filled. High in the pulpit vault, Cor Talek's secondary heart stuttered as he felt the offering reach the threshold. Each life was a spark in the warp, a brief flare of terror and pain as the pattern closed. He fed on the shape of it, directing it with the care of an artisan. "8 are the gates," he whispered. "Open for us." The ritual tipped. In the heart of Valith's reliquary, in the sealed chamber that had not known air since the age of the Great Crusade, wards that had endured 10,000 years, cracked in perfect unison. Psycho-reactive stone flared with light, its built-in algorithms of faith and denial overrun by the sheer volume of screaming souls being forced through its matrix. Something answered. A point of radiance formed beneath the crust, impossibly hot and perfectly cold at the same time. It expanded like a breath, held for an age finally being released. Every conduit that linked the reliquary to the hive above, every forgotten access shaft and prayer well, glowed for an instant as principles that mortal science had no words for were invoked. The sphere of light unfurled its awareness with the lazy inevitability of a star rising. Every astropathic choir in the Valith subsector screamed. In guard bastions and navy way stations, in roving rogue trader vessels and silent inquisitorial black ships, bound souls arched in their restraints and howled as the psychic shock tore through them. Blood ran from ruined sockets, flesh burst, vox slates exploded into static. Astro-telepathic traffic dropped to nothing in the space of a heartbeat, the threads of 100 ongoing conversations cut as cleanly as if a blade had been laid to them. The scream did not stop at the edge of the subsector. It attenuated as it traveled, but its pattern was precise, encoded with glyphs and counterglyphs buried in its harmonics. Far away, at the dark heart of the solar system, it brushed the outermost edges of the golden light of terror. Most of that impossible beacon rejected it, turned it aside, burned it away as another of the million irritants that gnawed at the Emperor's withered soul. A fragment penetrated. In the oubliette vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, in a chamber where the air tasted of dust and old blood, a single console flickered to life. It had been still for longer than most stars had shone. Frost lay thick on its casing, the cabling that linked it to the deeper systems buried under sealing wax and purity chains. Red warning sigils bloomed across its dead glass. Jean Wards tasted the echo in the scream and woke. Machine spirits stirred, ancient and irritable, recognizing the signature of a work sealed by the hand of the master of mankind, in an age when he still walked among men. They triggered a chain of silent alarms, each one keyed to the presence of a specific order of gene-forged warriors. The 10,000 were being called. A Castian Valerian felt the summons as a vibration in the bones of his skull. He stood alone in a meditation chamber lined with relic blades, his guardian spear planted before him, helm mag-locked at his belt. The filtered light of terror fell through the high apse windows, painting his auramite armor in shades of pale gold. The palace thrummed around him, a constant background presence, like the heartbeat of some titanic, slumbering beast. The vibration became a tone, a pattern. He recognized the cadence instantly. It was one he had studied in vaults that did not officially exist, under the eye of Shadowkeepers, whose names were written only in cryptic sigils in ledgers locked with more seals than most worlds. He opened his eyes. The door to the chamber irised open without sound. 2 custodians stood there. Their armor worked in darker shades, crimson cloaks heavy with purity seals. Between them walked a figure in heavy robes of deep black, his face lost in the shadow of his hood. A thin adamantine chain ran from his wrist to a case he carried cradled in his other arm. "Shield Captain a Castian Valerian," the robed man said. His voice was dry as folded parchment. "You are summoned to Strategium Vault Gamma by decree of the Shadowkeepers." Valerian did not ask why. He simply inclined his head, took up his helm, and followed. Strategium Vault Gamma lay far below the visible palace, deeper than the great audience halls and the endless administratum stacks, deeper even than the catacombs where other wars were recorded in silence. It was a sphere of black stone, its surface traced with faint sigils that crawled away from the gaze like shy vermin. In its center hung a single hololithic representation, the light emanating from it the only illumination. A world turned slowly there, wrapped in shifting clouds, its seas and continents caught in a level of detail no common cartograph unit could match. Its hives gleamed like thorns. Overlaid on the image were ghostly script lines, annotations in high Gothic, old iterators' marks, compliance codes, Vaelith, according to the primary legend. A Castian Valerian stepped onto the observation ring. A custodian in darker armor waited there, his cloak a shade of red that drank the little light rather than reflecting it. His helm was wrought in a more angular style, its cheek plates etched with keys and locks. "Tribune," Valerian said. "Shield Captain," the Shadowkeeper replied. "You are familiar with Vaelith." "I have read the accounts of its compliance," Valerian said. "A shrine world raised upon the bones of an archive world, when the Great Crusade still burned bright. A place where the Master tested certain principles beneath the crust, then ordered them sealed, and the records restricted." The Tribune inclined his head. Beside him, almost an afterthought, stood another figure in layered robes of fine cloth, face hidden behind a featureless veil of silken mesh. The cut of his garb spoke of the Senatorum Imperialis, but no specific office was declared. "The principles have woken," the Tribune said. "A psychic and noospheric event has registered across a broad swathe of the segmentum obscurus. Its signature matches the locked pattern for Vaelith's primary vault." The hololithic world flickered. For a moment, a new light pulsed beneath its surface, a ghostly echo of the impossible sphere that burned now at its heart. Valerian watched it, his expression unreadable. "What was buried there," he said, "has tasted the warp." "Word-bearers," the Tribune said, "and iron warriors. Their fleet movements and certain intercepted litanies align with the event. They have turned Vaelith into a shrine to their own profane vision. They feed the buried thing with blood and prayer. They mean to raise it up, twist it into a weapon or a door, or both." The veiled Senatorum emissary shifted slightly, as if bristling at the casual mention of traitor names in this place. "The High Lords will not countenance a second Webway debacle," the emissary said. His voice was controlled, but there was iron under it. The Master's prior works are not to be allowed to fall into the hands of the archenemy, nor are they to be broadly known. This event must be contained. Quietly. Absolutely. Valerian nodded once. It is not a matter for inquisitors or guard crusades, the Tribune said, nor for Loudhammer chapters who trumpet their every deployment from the hulls of their ships. It is a matter for the 10,000. I will take a shield host, Valerian said. You will take more than Auramite, the emissary said softly. You will take a butcher to scour the world when you are done. On the hololith, a second light bloomed, far from Valeth. A cluster of void signatures, each marked with the predatory icon of a shark's jaw clamped around a world. In the deep void between roots, the Tribune said, drifts a certain fleet, unbound by most strictures, answerable directly, in certain matters, to this palace. They have received an astropathic fragment. Valerian listened to the recording as it played. A single voice, distorted by the warp, translated into Binharic and then back again into sound. A message pared down to its core. Valeth, it said, compliance by fire, by will of the throne. Far out beyond the shipping lanes, in the airless dark between systems, a grey-hulled strike cruiser hung with all its running lights extinguished. It drifted like a carcass in black water. Around it were lesser shapes, escorts and tenders, and attack craft, all equally dark. Inside the cruiser, in a strategium lit by a single red lumen, Void Marshal Karen Mako listened to the same message. He stood bare-headed, his scalp shaven to stubble, his features weathered and pale in the half-light. His plate was the drab grey of his chapter, broken only by the white of a serrated jaw symbol on his shoulder and the dark stains of old blood around his gorget. Behind him, other Carcharodons stood in attentive silence, their helms held under their arms, predatory eyes fixed upon their commander. Valeth, Mako repeated, testing the name. A shrine world. One of many, Marshal, said a chaplain in blackened plate, his voice a rasp. But this one bears the palace's direct mark. Mako's lips thinned. He ran a scarred thumb over the teeth of his chain blade, where it rested against the hololith table. Compliance by fire, he said. The chaplain inclined his head. The throne wills a world burned, he said. We are well suited to the work. Mako looked up at the hololith. The image of Valeth rotated there, pulled from those same ancient compliance records, untouched by the knowledge of what now seethed beneath its crust. He could already picture the hives in ruin, the cathedra cracked, the seas boiling ash. Rouse the fleet, he said. Set course. We hunt a shrine. On Valeth, deep in the cathedral vaults, Dark Apostle Kor Talek felt something brush against the edges of his perception. He paused in his sermon, just long enough for the vox to hiss with static, and lifted his gaze to the unseen heavens above the hive roofs and the cloud layer and the thinning atmosphere. Behind the covered lenses of his helm, his eyes narrowed. Golden light, cold as a blade, old and merciless, and with it, somewhere just beyond his full reach, something else, a flicker of cold grey, like teeth in deep water. The corpse remembers, he murmured. His acolytes shifted uneasily. Around him, the choir of chant dipped, then surged back to full volume. Kor Talek laughed, the sound rich and exultant. Rejoice, children, he said, throwing his arms wide once more. The throne has heard your saints' defiance. The last golden wardens stir in their cage. They come for us across the sea of souls. They come in their arrogance, thinking to seal again what we have woken. His voice rose, a whip crack of exultation. We will show them a world on fire, he roared. We will drown their Auramite in the blood of their lost empire. We will take the Emperor's own hounds and break their necks upon the stones of our saint's altar. The word-bearers and the iron warriors will write a new scripture here in burning cities and shattered gene-wrought flesh. The eightfold chant thundered in answer. Above and below, from reliquary sump to spire top, Valith trembled as its future rushed toward it through the dark, carried in golden hulls and grey, in the hearts of the 10,000 and the void sharks who followed in their shadow. The hall of armory was a forest of gold and shadow. Vaulted arches rose like the ribs of some petrified colossus, their inner surfaces carved with reliefs of forgotten campaigns. Statuary lined the long nave, each figure a custodian captured in marble at the moment of some ancient victory. The light that fell from the high lanterns was filtered through crystal wards, so that every surface shone with a softened radiance, unmarred by the garish glare of more common lumens. In that ordered glow, the shield host assembled. Heteron guards stood in a silent line along the central aisle, their auramite plate burnished to a muted sheen. Plumes of crimson and sable rose from their crested helms. Each bore a guardian spear wrought in a pattern that marked him as one of the Emperor's own inner sentinels, blade and bolter both engraved with sigils of warding that had been laid down when the palace walls were still new. Behind them, Aquilon terminators moved into place with measured tread, each step a slow thunder on the polished stone. Their heavy warplate was engraved with wings and laurels and the stylized sunburst of the throne, but there was nothing ornamental in their mass. They were walking siege engines built to break the backs of fortresses and to stride unbowed through storms that would atomize lesser beings. At the edges of the hall, shadows pooled in deliberate contrast to the gold. They stood there, unmoving, their presence and absence. Null maidens, the silent sisterhood, seconded from their own hidden bastions for this one purpose. Their armor was plain compared to the auramite splendor around them, dull plates of muted bronze and iron beneath dark robes. They wore no helms, for their shaven heads and blank, implacable faces were their only heraldry. Around each, the air seemed slightly thinner, the sound slightly flatter, as if reality itself had drawn in a breath and held it. Custodians did not like to stand close to them. Even without psychic gift, the gene-wrought guardians of the throne felt the guttering of the warp where the sisters walked, the sense of some vast external gaze cut off. It was like standing in the eye of a surgical storm. They endured it, as they endured all things. A Castian Valerian descended the hall of armory with his helm carried under his arm, cloak whispering against the steps behind him. He walked through the ranked warriors without a spoken word. Each custodian he passed tilted his helm the bare fraction that protocol allowed. Valerian's gaze took them in one by one, measuring, weighing, committing faces and armor markings to the perfect memory that had been built into his bones, along with his gene-crafted might. At the far end of the hall, beneath a relief of the Emperor in warplate, the tribune of the Shadowkeepers waited. His armor was darker than Valerian's, the gold of its plates alloyed with some deeper metal that seemed to drink the light. His cloak was crimson, but it held no gloss, the cloth matte as dried blood. A key sigil hung at his gorget, worked in black iron. His helm was off, revealing a face seamed with thin scars that could have been ritual marks or the relics of old battles. His eyes were the color of old, amber, steady and unreadable. Beside him stood the veiled emissary of the Senatorum, hands folded within his sleeves, posture that of one who knew his voice weighed worlds. "Tribune," Valerian said, coming to a halt before them. "Shield Captain," the Shadowkeeper replied. His tone was as level as a blade laid on an anvil. "Your host is assembled." "They are sufficient," Valerian said. It was not a question. "For the vault," the Tribune said, "and for those who think to profane it." He did not bother to name the traitor legions. Their titles were an insult to the heir of this hall. The veiled emissary shifted, his mesh mask turning fractionally toward the assembled custodians. "There will be no Astra Militarum deployed to Valith," he said. "No Titan legions, no orbital plates declaring banners and honors. The Lords of Terror will not seed that world with more witnesses than are strictly necessary." Valerian did not look at him. His gaze remained on the tribune. "The thing beneath Vaelith," the emissary continued, as if irritated by the shield captain's lack of deference, "is not a relic to be bandied about on administratum ledgers. It is an artifact of the Master, from an age when his works were more ambitious. It was sealed at cost. It was meant to stay as it is. The word-bearers and their iron wretches have already done more than enough harm by waking it." "You do not trust the Astra Militarum to keep a secret," Valerian said. "We do not trust anyone to keep this secret," the emissary replied. "That is why you are here, Shield Captain. The 10,000 exist for such necessities." "The Custodians will be the killing edge," the Tribune said, "but you will not be alone. Vaelith is infested. To strike only at the vault is to leave the scars of what has occurred open upon the flesh of the Imperium. There must be a scalpel, and there must be fire." Valerian tilted his head slightly. "Deniable assets," he said. The veiled man's voice was almost amused. "Void sharks," he said. "They swim close to censure, always. They are useful when a world must be made to simply stop existing, and no one must be able to say with certainty who ended it." Valerian had read the sealed reports. An obscure chapter, thinly recorded, their heraldry a serrated jaw. Their methods were not subtle, but they were thorough, and when the throne whispered a certain kind of command, they came. "The Carcharodons," he said. The Tribune nodded once. "They are already turning toward Vaelith," he said. "They will meet you at the edge of the system. You will confer. You will decide how deep to drive the blade, and how hot to make the fire." Valerian looked down the hall again, at his assembled warriors, at the silent sisters in their shadowed alcoves. "No guard regiments," he said. "No god machines. Only the 10,000 and the sharks." "That is sufficient," the Tribune said. "That is necessary," the veiled emissary added. Valerian inclined his head. The matter was decided. Far away in the unlit decks of the Carcharodons' flagship, the work of ending worlds was never truly finished. The air reeked of oil, disinfectant, and old blood. Chains hung from the overheads, swaying with the constant tremor of the void engines. Hooks were set along the walls, bearing trophies taken from the last war. Skulls, flensed clean and oiled, their eye sockets filled with waxed parchment on which were inked the names of the worlds from which they had been taken. Pieces of armor, bent and scorched, bearing the heraldry of a dozen different regiments and chapters, arranged in mosaics that meant something only to the killers who had gathered them. On one of the lower decks, a crew of mortal serfs worked in silence over a line of armored corpses. The dead still wore their plate, grey armor scored and cracked, blessed dents and impact, scars telling the story of the battle that had taken them. Serfs with augmetic saws and flensing blades moved with practiced care, cutting armor seals that had locked flesh and ceramite together in death. They peeled the Astartes' bodies from their shells, muscles and bone coming away in great sheets. There was no reverence in the act, only efficiency. The gene-wrought dead had already been recorded, their gene seed reclaimed, their names inscribed in the chapter's hidden ledger. What remained was material. The armor would be patched, reforged, made ready for another wearer. The meat would serve other purposes. A chaplain moved along the line, his armor the same grey as his brother's, but marked with blackened crozius and bone-coloured heraldry. He dipped a gauntleted thumb into bowls of collected blood and grease, marking each empty plate with the kill tallies of its previous bearer, blending the history of one warrior into the future of another. "World of Black." "Ice," intoned one of the serfs, voice flat as he read from a slate. "Compliance level achieved. Population rendered non-viable." The chaplain inscribed a tiny rune for that world on the inner rim of a pauldron, whispered a short rite, and moved on. "Shrine Moon of unnamed system," another serf murmured. "Compliance level achieved. Ecclesiarchy presence neutralized. Population reduced to marginal." Another rune. another smear of old blood. The rhythm of it was almost soothing. Death into record, record into armor, armor into war. In a separate chamber, another ritual was underway. Here, the chains from the ceiling held not trophies, but weapons. Chainswords hung in rows, blades cleaned but never polished, the nicks and gouges of use left visible beneath the oil. Some had teeth made from ceramite, others from serrated Xeno's bone. A few bore the distinctive curve and rasp of real shark teeth, taken from titanic void predators that hunted the gas layers of dead worlds. A line of chaplains moved beneath them, chanting in low voices. They carried vials of blood drawn from the chapter's own gene stock, mixed with the rendered fat of worthy enemies. With each step, they anointed the hung weapons, pressing the tips of their fingers to teeth and grips, whispering kill prayers. Worlds yet unnamed, they rasped. Seas yet unboiled, flesh yet unflenced. The throne wills the hunt wills the kill feeds the ledger. Shark jaw heraldry plates lay on a shrine table, each one being re-edged with fresh tooth and scrap metal, the better to catch and tear. When a Carcharodon smashed his shoulder into an enemy line, he did so with a weapon even before his chainsword bit. Void Marshal Karan Mako walked between the rituals without comment. His presence was a weight in the air. Serfs bowed their heads as he passed. Chaplains dipped their crowsey in acknowledgement, never interrupting their rites, but adjusting them subtly to include this new axis of focus. The message from Terra sat in his vox implant like a burning brand. Vailith. They made their translation into the way station system with their ships dark and their weapons silent, as befit hunters arriving at the edge of a new sea. The way station was a neutral construct, an old administratum hub repurposed as a minor trade knot. It hung above a dead world, its rings and spars bristling with docking claws and battered auspex arrays. Void traffic had been cleared by decree that cited solar storms and relay maintenance. No one had been told that certain ships would be meeting there, whose presence would have turned most sane crewmen's bowels to water. The Custodes cruiser came first, a blade of gold edged in shadow, its hull marked only with sigils that most augur servitors simply edited out as errors. It locked into the way station's highest dock like a king seating himself upon a throne. The Carcharodons' flagship slid in beneath it, a grey predator lurking under the glow of something much larger and older. Its hull was scarred and patchworked, kill markings etched into its plating in crude yet precise strokes. In the way station's central hall, under flickering lumen globes and the faded banners of a dozen forgotten administratum campaigns, a Castian Valerian met Karan Mako. Valerian came with a small honor guard of custodians, each a pillar of gold and crimson. With them walked 3 null maidens, their faces blank, their presence cutting the warp like a knife. The air around them felt cold, the colors leached from the rusted walls. Mako came with a half-dozen of his commanders. They wore their armor bare, without heraldry cloaks or display. Their faces were pale and weathered, their eyes dark and hungry, as if they had once belonged to men who had lived under alien suns and now had no home but the void. They moved like predators, their attention never resting on any one point for long. For a moment the two lines faced one another, gold and grey, the Emperor's first guardians and those who hunted in his name at the edge of memory. Valerian broke the stillness. "Void Marshal," he said. "Shield Captain," Mako replied. His low Gothic was flat, accented oddly, as if he had learned the language among people who had never heard the cultured speech of the core worlds. There was no deference in his tone, but there was no obvious disrespect either. His gaze flicked to the null maidens and lingered there for a heartbeat, unfazed by their deadening aura. "The palace calls us together," Valerian said. "Vailith has woken something that was meant to sleep." Mako's lips twitched, almost a smile. "The priesthood of lies cracked a seal," he said. We have been told enough. A world must be made quiet. The vault must be sealed, Valerian said. The work beneath the crust must be reclaimed or unmade. The traitor legions upon the surface must be destroyed. Their mortal offerings must be denied to their ritual. The obvious answer, Mako said, is to kill everything that breathes, and then continue until the rock itself screams. One of the Carcharodons at his flank gave a soft grunt of agreement. Valerian's expression did not change. A vault wrought by the master himself lies beneath that rock, he said. We are not free to simply cast cyclonic ordnance and be done. Mako spread his scarred hands. You are the 10,000, he said. You will descend to the throat and cut it clean. My brothers will scour the body. The Custodes will drive a spearhead into the reliquary core, Valerian said. We strike for the heart, through whatever the word-bearers and iron warriors have raised above it. We cannot be distracted by the wider battle. That is where your chapter will serve. Mako's eyes narrowed slightly. You would have us paint the surface with blood, he said, while you pick at some. Buried knot. Valerian met his gaze. The buried knot, he said quietly, is a work begun by the Emperor before your genetic line was ever conceived. If it is turned fully to the service of the dark gods, they will not require Vaelith's surface at all. They will not require your worlds or mine. They will reach through that knot and pull threads you cannot imagine. For a moment, there was no sound except the crackle of the station's failing lumens. Mako inclined his head, slow and deliberate. You speak in a way that smells like truth, he said. Fine. The sharks will take the seas and the shallows. We will break the cults, the human chattel, the half-built fortresses. We will starve the saint they are trying to raise. You, Auramite, will go for its heart. His gaze hardened. But we will not temper our work for the sake of delicacy, he added. If your warriors stray into the tide, they do so at their own risk. Valerian thought of the silent sisters standing at his back, of the Heteron Guard and the Aquilon, of the centuries of training and lethal precision forged into each gene-wrought frame. He thought of the thing that had screamed from Vaelith. They will not stray, he said. Mako gave a grunt that might have been amusement. So, he said, we are agreed. There is one more matter, Valerian said. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them by a pace. The air between gold and grey thinned. When we stand upon Vaelith, he said, voice softer now, you will heed my word when I invoke the will of the master of mankind. There will be no questions, no delays. If I say that a target is to be spared for as long as it takes us to reach it, you will hold your blades. For an instant, the Carcharodon's face changed. The hunger there grew sharper. The idea of being denied a kill, even for a heartbeat, ran against the grain of his chapter's being. Then Mako inclined his head again, just enough to be seen as compliance. When you speak in his name, he said, we listen. When you do not, we hunt as we are. It was as much promise as any could ask of him. En route to Vaelith, the void turned against them. Warp storms were rarely static things. They moved and twisted like living scars in reality, growing and shrinking, opening and closing with little regard for the neat schedules of Imperial navigators. Even so, the storm that rose ahead of the combined Custodes and Carcharodons fleet was unusual. It smelled of laughter. On the bridge of the Carcharodons' flagship, the warp view was a smear of colors and light patterns that had no sane correspondence to material vision. Tendrils of incandescent energy wriggled past the hull, brushing against the Geller field with sullen malice. Shapes in the distance coiled and uncoiled, never quite resolving into anything the mortal eye could track. In the Libraria Sanctum, a single psyker knelt in chains. His armor was stripped down, only the barest plates left to cover him. His eyes were blindfolded. His mouth was gagged with a device that bit into his jaw and kept his tongue crushed to the floor of his mouth. Sigils of warding had been carved into his flesh and then burned over with brands until they were white ridges under the skin. Even with all that, the warp found him. He jerked in his restraints, cords standing out in his neck, the sound he made behind the gag a raw animal noise. The chaplains who stood watch did not move to soothe him. They watched, Crozy held ready, waiting to see if any of the demons pressing their faces against the Gellerfield would find a purchase through him. His mind burned with images, stone beneath a world, carved into shapes that bent light around them. A knot of paths, all leading nowhere. A figure moving through those paths, taller than any Astartes, face unreadable, eyes like burning suns, hands bloody with the act of closing doors that should never have been opened, the stink of betrayal, the taste of disappointment, like iron in the mouth. A vault that remembers, the librarian choked through the gag, a vault that remembers the Emperor's sin. A chaplain made a warding sign. Sin is a mortal thing, he hissed. He does not sin. He acts. He judges. You speak heresy, brother. The librarian laughed, or wept. In the warp, the storm bared its teeth and pressed closer. On the Custodes cruiser, the storm was felt only as a slight increase in hull vibration, a faint tightening of the air. The Gellerfield generators of that ship were machines that had been personally overseen by the Master in ages long past. They hummed now with absolute denial, a wall even the most brazen demons broke teeth upon. Within the ship, the Custodes prepared. The arming shrines were arranged like chapels, each a small cell lined with relics. Armor rested in adamantine racks, pieces disassembled and laid out like the bones of a saint. Tech adepts in red robes moved among them, their Binharik cant a steady counterpoint to the low murmur of custodian prayer. Valerian stood before his own armor frame, naked to the waist, scarred flesh gleaming with sacred oils. A tech adept raised a chalice of black unguent, his mechadendrites clicking as he adjusted the flow. By the Treaty of Olympus, the adept intoned, his voice layered with vox tones. By the first pacts made upon the Red Planet, by the will of the Omnissiah, made manifest in steel and code, we anoint this plate. He spread the unguent over the inner surfaces of the auramite, tracing sigils that shone briefly before sinking into the metal. With each marker laid down, he whispered a string of numbers and words in ancient Terran dialects, half prayer, half technical litany. Another adept checked the seals on Valerion's guardian spear, muttering in pure Binharik, the chittering machine language falling from metal lips. As he did so, a Custodes canticle unspooled from a vox grill in the shrine ceiling, sung in a tongue no mortal throat could manage, the words older than most human nations. Valerian stepped into his armor. The plates closed around him with the hiss of displaced air and the deep thud of locking clamps, each segment sealed with a reassurance that came up through his skin as much as through the helm's display. His inner vision filled with data runes, targeting glyphs, structural reinforcement maps. He flexed one hand, feeling the servos answer him with perfect synchrony. His guardian spear locked into its harness with a heavy click. The Adrathic destructor mounted along its haft, pulsed as its micro-reactors came online, hungry for targets. Melter bombs and other shaped charges waited in their clasps on his belt, each one a precisely engineered end to some stubborn piece of matter. The Null Maidens passed along the avenues between shrines, their steps silent, their faces as empty as ever. Wherever they walked, the faint itch of the warp died completely. Some of the tech adepts stiffened as they passed, their link to their machine spirits suddenly muted. They did not complain. They knew their place in this order. The storm's laughter faded as the fleet tore through it, leaving only a lingering echo. When the combined Loyalist force dropped back into real space at the edge of the Valith system, the first thing they saw was steel. The outer orbital network that had once been a loose ring of pilgrim docks and astropathic buoys was gone. In its place rose bastions. They were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were effective. Great blocks of armored hull, riveted and welded, bristling with lance batteries and macro cannon. Chains of mined wreckage and corpse hulks strung between them like filthy prayer beads, turning the space around Valith into a murder field of flak and shrapnel. Every visible surface was engraved or overlaid with sigils. Some were angular, hexagrammatic wards of a style the Iron Warriors favored when they wished to protect their fortifications, even from the attentions of their own demons. Others were cruder, 8 pointed and jagged, the mark of the Pantheon cut into metal. Valerian stood on the observation platform, watching the augur ghosts resolve into solid shapes. "They have not been idle," he said. On the Custodes Voxnet, his voice carried to every relevant station, unmarred by static or delay. "Form assault wedges," he ordered. "We go through, we do not waste time. The longer we linger in this orbit, the more blood the word-bearers can spill below." On the Carcharodons flagship, Karen Mako watched the same augur feed, his jaw working slightly, as if he were tasting the defenses. "Big walls," one of his captains muttered behind him. "Big walls break the same as small," Mako said. He opened a fleet channel. No formalities, no titles, just his voice, carried to every ship bearing the serrated jaw. "Brothers," he said, "there is work. There is a world between us and the kill. The Auramite will strike for the deep meat. We clear the bones." 3 words followed, and every Carcharodon who heard them felt his blood quicken, his hands tighten upon weapon grips. Loose the tide. The war for Valith began with the dead. They drifted in a high orbit in numbers no sane mind could catalogue, a slow shroud of frozen flesh and broken steel around the world below. Pilgrim vessels, mass conveyance barges, refitted ore haulers, whole processional fleets that had once borne chanting faithful to Valith's shrines now hung gutted and hollow, their holds vented, their crews and passengers poured into the void. Iron warriors had toiled here, patient as ever. They had cracked the hulls and bled the ships, then chained their carcasses into rings around the new bastion stations. Bodies had frozen where they spilled, clothing and skin crystallized, hair drifting in, stiff halos. Some clung still to fragments of torn deck plating, eyes long emptied, mouths frozen mid-prayer. Others were spread as clouds of bone dust, ground down by the passage of armor and debris. The corpses served a purpose even in death. They were ablative mass, meat and metal, mixed into a cloud that would confuse auspex and soak the first wild volleys of any invading force. Ammunition spent on the already dead was ammunition not striking the bastions. When the Custodes and Carcharodons translated into the Valith system, their augurs first reported not ships, nor weapons, nor the planet itself, but the storm of human remains. On the command deck of the Custodes flagship, the hololiths drew it in cold lines of light. "Bodies," one of the tech adepts said, his voice little more than breath behind his vox grill. "Organic debris of significant density. Spread pattern suggests deliberate emplacement." "Pilgrim fleets," a Castian Valerian said. He watched the ghost light swirl, forming filaments and clumps around the hard-edged icons of the Iron Warriors' bastions. The bastions themselves were outlined as solid blocks, their armor profiles pulsing with threat runes. Macro cannon barrels jutted from them like the thorns of some iron flower. Lance batteries and defense lasers showed as clusters of crimson motes. The station guns woke as soon as the first loyalist signatures brushed the outer edges of Valith's sensor web. Fire erupted in the dark. Iron Warriors' macro batteries did not waste shots. They had calculated likely vectors of approach, plotted firing solutions long before the enemy arrived. They cast shells and beams into the corpse fields with mechanical precision, detonations blossoming as bright spheres where rounds hit flesh clouds or some chunk of hidden wreck. The Carcharodons felt the opening salvo as a shiver through their decks. On one of the smaller escort craft, a lean predator of a vessel that had once been a fast trader and was now stripped and refitted beyond recognition, the first impacts registered as tremors underfoot, then as alarms. "Void breaches on the outer hull," a serf cried, hands dancing over runes. "Shields dipping. They are walking their fire across the field toward us." The captain, a grey-armoured Astartes, whose name had been spoken only once into the chapter's ledger, bared his teeth. "Hold course," he said. "We ride the dead." The escort rode in the wake of a larger strike cruiser, close enough that on many Auspex sweeps it was mistaken for scrap trailing behind the bigger ship. The escort's hull was painted in void black, its shark jaw heraldry dulled, Vox silence its constant companion. It had survived many ambushes by being forgotten until it was too late. Forgotten or not, the Iron Warrior's firing lattice did not miss it. A defense laser, slave to a machine spirit that had been taught patience and spite by the sons of Perturabo, lanced out from a bastion. The beam cut through the corpse field without care, turning frozen pilgrims and twisted deck plating into a curtain of expanding vapor. The escort hit that curtain at speed. For an instant, the ship seemed to swim in a sea of light. Then the beam reached its heart. The strike cruiser's sacrifice shield absorbed the first caress. The escort had no such luxury. Its own voids flared and failed in a heartbeat. The laser punched through its spine. Armor glass burst inward on every deck. Atmosphere vented in white gouts. Men and Astartes alike were drawn out into the void, their bodies twisting as they tumbled, limbs ripped from sockets, blood flash freezing in feathered clouds. They died without ever seeing the station that had killed them. Across the Loyalist formation, other escorts burned. Whole shoals of smaller craft, attack boats and cutters, vanished in staccato flares of light as the Iron Warrior's pre-plotted firing solution unfolded. Void ignited and void darkened again, leaving only expanding gas clouds and spinning wreckage. In the heart of that storm, the auramite prow of the Custodes flagship moved forward at a measured pace. The 10,000 did not alter course. They did not swing wide in search of a safer approach. They advanced in a formation that had been devised in a different age, when the Master had first ordered his golden warriors into the teeth of a hostile void. Void shields flared around the golden hull, layer over layer, the outermost fields taking the brunt of the incoming fire and shunting the energy along carefully calculated paths. Lances that would have cored a battleship in a single sustained strike broke against those shields, their force deflected, their beams reduced to blazing lines that crawled over inert armor. Specialized spear ships moved around the flagship, slender compared to the blunt bastion killers of more conventional fleets. Their prows were less armored, their engines tuned for exact positioning rather than brute speed. They used the larger vessel as partial cover, drifting in its shadow, then darting out to loose their weapons. They did not answer quantity with quantity. Custodes did not attempt to match the Iron Warriors slug for slug. They struck instead at the mind of the enemy defense grid. Command nodes here, here, and here, intoned a tech adept, his mechadendrites pointing out faintly glowing loci within the Bastion network. Centralized fire control, data collation hubs. If we sever these, their coordination drops significantly. Assign each to a spear, Valerian said. Lances of pure stellar fire stabbed out from the Loyalist spearships. They were not wide beams. The Custodes had no interest in wasting energy on impressive displays. Each lance was needle-thin, compressed and contained, focused to a point that could be placed upon a single viewport or sensor dish. The first bastion to take a hit staggered visibly. The lance drilled through a sensor spine, then bored on into the core, where a cogitator nexus sat encased in meters of plasteel. Protective armor boiled away under the focused energy. Machine spirits shrieked in Binharik as their housings collapsed. Control crews, mortal and servitor, were flash vaporized, their screams stolen before they could leave their throats. The bastion's fire pattern stuttered. A gap opened in the lattice of bolts and beams. Through that gap, a Custodes strike group moved. Teleportarium solutions locked, a vox thrummed. Within the belly of the flagship, Aquilon Terminators stood within rune-inscribed circles. Teleport coils hummed around them, their ancient mechanisms coming to lethal readiness. Each giant warrior gripped his weapon, armor seals locked, every system in his plate at full operation. A voice counted down in High Gothic. The world dissolved. The furnace heart of the Iron Warriors' Bastion was a place of heat and smoke, its air tasting of metal, vapor and the ghost of Promethium. Reactor cores thrummed behind armored bulkheads. Their output fed along glowing conduits to guns and shields, and the life support of the station's skeleton crew. Into that hell, the Custodes arrived. They materialized in a storm of light and thunder, teleport energies snapping back into normal space, with the awful inevitability of a snapped cable. For an instant, the air around them was a corona of ghost lightning. Then it cleared, leaving hulking figures of auramite and wrath. The first shots came even before the after echoes of the teleport faded. Iron warriors did not leave their hearts undefended. Bolter fire howled from firing ports along the walls, shells streaking toward the newcomers in a storm of superheated mass. Heavy weapons boomed, the shriek of autocannons joining the crack of small arms. The bastion's interior defenses, set to respond to any incursion, filled the corridors with lethal metal in the time it took a normal man to blink. The Aquilon moved forward as if they walked in rain. Bolt shells exploded against their plate, throwing gouts of fire and shrapnel. Heavy caliber rounds struck with hammer blows that would have pulped a tank crew. The Terminator's armor rang and shuddered, but did not yield. Their storm bolters roared, each squeeze of a trigger sending a compact burst of mass reactive rounds back along the lines of fire. Where those shots struck, Iron Warriors and their mortal thralls simply ceased to be, torn apart in burgeoning blossoms of red mist and shattered steel. One corridor became a killing funnel. Iron Warriors had positioned overlapping fields of fire there. Turret servitors wired into ceiling nests, heavy bolters and Lascannon emplacements set to rake any assault. It had served them well when lesser boarding parties had tried their luck on other worlds. Now it met the 10,000. An Aquilon strode into the mouth of that funnel, his plate alight with the flicker of hits. Rounds detonated around his helm, chewing divots from his pauldrons. A last beam caught him full in the chest, burning a streak of scorched metal clean across the aquila engraved there. He did not slow. He waded through the storm, shoulder first, and raised his weapon. His return volley tore the emplacements to pieces. Turret servitors exploded in wet clangor, augmetic limbs spinning away, metal skulls flattened. The heavy bolter nests, designed to enfilade entire squads, became tombs as their armor cracked and internal ammunition storage cooked off. The Lascannon crews died as coherent light cut through their own barricades, the beams driven back into their stations by the sheer volume of fire the Custodes poured into them. Smoke and steam filled the passage. The Aquilon emerged from it like a walking statue, armor blackened but intact. His cloak had caught fire somewhere along the way. He did not bother to pat it out. It trailed behind him like a torn, burning banner. In a control chamber deeper in the bastion, a Warsmith lieutenant watched the feed from those corridors with a clenched jaw. His name was Corin Draxos. He had overseen the reinforcement of this station, calculated its load-bearing beams, overseen the emplacement of every gun. He had repelled raids by Xenos, by desperate Imperial frigates, by pirates and rival traitors. He had never seen anything walk through his defenses like this. "Cut power," he snapped. "Flood the core tunnels. Overpressure. If we cannot hold this station, we will turn it into a bomb in their faces." Tech thralls bent to their consoles, feeding new instructions into the reactor logic. In the guts of the bastion, valves slammed shut. Others opened. Pressure readings climbed. Coolant lines glowed red as heat that should have been bled away was recirculated. The reactors roared as they were pushed beyond their safe tolerances, their machine spirits howling warnings in Binharic that were overridden by iron-coded commands. In the corridor, the Aquilon felt the air change. It grew hotter in an instant, like opening a furnace door. Dry heat first, then wet, as superheated steam burst from deck vents and wall seams. He did not stop. The first blast of overpressured coolant hit him full on, a white wall of scalding vapor. It washed around his bulk, clinging, hissing against his plate. The purity seals on his chest bubbled and charred, parchment turning black. His cloak ignited properly, the flames now bright and hungry. Warning runes flickered on his inner helm display. He walked through the inferno. Behind him, other Aquilon advanced. Around them, servitors and mortal armsmen screamed as the steam stripped their skin and eyes. Flesh sloughed from bone. Metal warped and popped. The corridor became a charnel tunnel in which only the golden giants still moved. Corin Draxos looked up from his consoles as the main hatch to the control chamber glowed dull red, then white, then failed. The door, blue inward, molten edges spraying across the deck. Into the gap stepped the Aquilon, cloak a sheet of fire, every edge of his armor glowing a dull cherry where the heat had kissed it. For an instant, Draxos saw his own reflection in the warrior's lenses. He raised his bolter anyway, because he was Iron Warriors, and that was what Iron Warriors did. The Custodian's guardian spear moved with deceptive languor. The blade passed through the barrel of the bolter, then through Draxos's gorget, the ceramite there parting as if it were cheap plate. The crow's voice, half a command, half a curse, died in his throat. His head left his shoulders in a clean, almost neat arc, helm and all, striking the deck and bouncing once before rolling to a stop near a cogitator bank. The command staff saw it. They saw their warsmith's lieutenant die as if he had been some feeble scribist struck by a careless stride. Whatever discipline Perturabo's teachings had given them fractured. They fired wildly, some at the custodian, some at each other. A few turned to flee, bolters half raised, eyes wide. They did not get far. The Aquilon moved through them with slow, clinical efficiency, each thrust of his spear or squeeze of his stormbolter ending a life. When the room fell silent, he planted a melter bomb on the primary control nexus, turned, and walked back out through the still burning doorway. Elsewhere in the orbital storm, the Carcharodons were at work. One of the corpse hulks, a shattered mass conveyor whose bow had been torn away by some past battle, twitched as the Loyalist fleet closed. Its engines, long cold, flared for a heartbeat. Pustules of grown flesh bloomed along its hull, opening into weeping maws. The ship's vox arrays exuded a sound that was almost words, a wet gargling mockery of human speech. Demon engines were never elegant things. They were compromises, obscene marriages of metal and warp entity. This one had been given the mass of a small city and told to hold the outer ring. Assault rams slammed into its hull. The Carcharodons came in low, riding the corpse fields as cover, their prow armor gouging furrows through frozen bodies. When they were close enough that the demon engine filled their forward view, they fired their rams. Adamantine-tipped cylinders burst from their hulls, trailing cables. They struck the warped armor with enough force to dent it inward, then melted their own way through with shaped charges. Boarding torpedoes followed, Bullet shapes punched out of the strike vessel's launch bays, spinning slightly as they crossed the short gap. The demon ship's flak guns caught some, bursting them into blooms of fire and debris. Enough made it through. They hit the hull and bit deep, their own internal mechanisms boring into rusted metal and grown flesh alike. Hatches irised open, and grey armoured figures poured out. The Carcharodons entered the demon engine in silence. No voxed slogans, no battle cries. Each warrior's external channel was cut, his attention locked on his visor feed and the silent glyphs that marked his squad's kill assignment. The interior was a maze of twisted corridors and growths, pipes and cables fused with distended veins. Light came from clusters of phosphorescent fungus and patches of simmering warp fire clinging to bulkheads. Possessed servitors shambled along the passages, limbs lengthened or shortened, eyes replaced with weeping sores. Word-bearer squads had taken up firing positions at intersections, armor glistening wetly where demonic pack marks pulsed. The first Astartes sighted them and opened fire. The Carcharodons advanced anyway. They moved low and fast, weapons raised. Bolter fire snarled from their guns, the roar of mass reactive shells harsh in the close confines. A word-bearer staggered as rounds slammed into his chest, splitting the profaned Aquila there. He fell back against the pulsing wall, helm striking the fleshy growth. With a wet smack, the growth opened, revealing teeth. The wall itself took him, pulling him in even as he tried to scream. A Carcharodon stalked past the spot, chainsword idling at his hip. He did not spare the sight a second glance. A possessed servitor lurched at him, its arms blown off at the elbows, tongues of warp fire streaming from its mouth. The Astartes caught it by the throat with one hand, squeezed until the fire guttered, then tore its head free. There was no shouted praise, no counted kills, only work. On one gunnery deck of another bastion, a man named Elian watched a different kind of work. Elian was not Iron Warriors. He was a conscript, taken from a conquered Agri world and given a flak vest and a laser gun. He had never fired the laser gun in anger. For his diligence in obeying orders, for his willingness to stand where he was told and press the rune that matched the one he had been assigned, he had been elevated. Now he served as a loader on a macro cannon. When the Custodes spear ships had cut through the first layer of defenses, the Iron Warriors had pulled every able-bodied thrall to the guns. Elian had stood where his overseer shouted and did as he was told. He had not thought of the ships outside as anything more than colored icons on the Auspex repeaters. Then the armor glass of the bridge wall fractured. It did not crack slowly. It did not give warning with spiderweb lines of stress. It simply imploded, the reinforced pain collapsing inward in a single concussive moment. Pressure alarms screamed as atmosphere began to boil out of the breach. Loose objects flew past Elian, tugged toward the widening hole. Into that chaos stepped a giant clad in gold. Elian had never seen a custodian before. He had heard whispers of them from Iron Warriors who liked to boast of ancient wars, of sieges fought under the shadow of the palace. They had spoken of golden wardens who had never taken a step back, whose spears had reaped whole squads of Astartes at a time. Looking at the figure now, Elian felt something inside him rupture. It might have been faith in the word-bearer's sermons. It might have been his last remnants of sanity. The custodian walked through the shattered armor glass, as if stepping over a threshold. The void seemed to slide off him. His cloak flapped in the suction wind, snapping around his legs. Warning runes flickered over his helm lenses, and then died as his armor compensated. He lifted his guardian spear. The Iron Warrior's bridge officers reacted with drilled instinct. Bolters swung to bear. Orders were shouted, though Elian could not hear them over the howl of leaking air. Shots burst toward the intruder, tracer lines painting the air. The custodian's spear moved in a blur of brass and steel. He shot first, the weapon's built-in bolter spitting a controlled burst that punched through the chest plates of two Astartes before they could fully train their own guns. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. The spear's blade swept out, cutting an Iron Warrior's captain across the waist. The man's torso slid from his hips, armor joints hissing as they parted. Another step. A thrust. The Misericordia at the Custodian's belt flashed free, a secondary blade punching into the eye lens of a warsmith's adjutant, going straight through into the cortex behind. The man's helm burst at the back in a spray of gore and shattered ceramite. Elian stood frozen, a shell gripped in his hands, halfway to the macro cannon's loading chute. The Custodian's helm tilted, as if noting him. For a moment, Elian thought he would die. Instead, the giant turned away, as if the man were beneath even his killing notice, and set about dismantling the command crew with the same detached efficiency with which he might have cut down training targets. In seconds, the bridge that had directed fire across the orbit was painted with the remains of its masters. "Blow the charges!" Voice snarled over the Iron Warrior's internal vox. "All control stations, Bastions Alpha through Delta, detonate and fall back. We give them a graveyard to cross." Warsmith Demarcos Brack listened to the reports with a face of stone. His bastions were falling, not easily and not without cost to the invaders, but they were falling. The outer ring was compromised. The corpse fields were thinning. If he persisted in holding every fort, he would lose them all piecemeal and gain nothing. "Bring the inner ring online," he ordered. "All bastions marked crimson on grid 3. Prepare for self-detonation. Secondary stations, cut loose on my command and fall back toward Valith's exosphere. We will make the sky itself a minefield." His underlings obeyed. They might curse him later for abandoning their comrades, but they obeyed. They knew the logic of withdrawal, of trading ground for the chance to strike again. Bastions died at his word. Charges sat deep in their structures, detonated, ripping their cores apart. Hull sections tumbled free, the great guns that had once spat death now spinning uselessly into the dark. The chain fields that linked them became whirling webs of razor-edged debris, a gauntlet any pursuer would have to navigate at peril. Closer to the planet, surviving stations lit their engines and began slow burns inward, reconfiguring themselves as orbital platforms over Valith's exosphere. Their guns tilted down, their barrels realigned to pour fire into any invading craft that dared descend toward the hives. In the midst of all this, a single Carcharodon strike cruiser burned. Its name in the chapter's ledger would be marked with a line and a tally, the details known only to those who had inscribed it there. For now, to those who watched from the outside, it was simply a grey hull, torn open along one flank, void bleeds ragged, fire gouting from its mid-decks. It had taken the brunt of an Iron Warrior's capital ship's broadside. Macro shells the size of gun cutters had punched into its side and blossomed, ripping whole compartments away. Men and material vanished into the void. The cruiser's spine broke, its prow sagging, engines misaligned. "Drive core is unstable," a serf screamed over the internal vox. "We are losing containment. We cannot hold." On the command dais, Karen Mako tilted his head, listening to the damage reports with a predator's dispassion. The capital ship that had wounded them still loomed ahead, its own armor scorched and pitted, its gun decks flashing as it tried to realign for another volley. Lesser vessels swarmed around it, a nest of iron hornets. "Helm," Mako said. "Marshal," came the strained answer. "Point us at their heart," he said. "Lock all remaining thrust. Cut safeties. Vent every compartment between prow and mid-spine except this one. Then go." There was no hesitation. The Carcharodons did not cling to their ships. Vessels were knives. If a knife broke, you used the pieces as shrapnel. The strike cruiser lurched as its remaining engines howled at maximum output. It surged forward, straightening despite its broken back, its prow turning steadily toward the enemy capital ship. Bulkheads slammed shut behind fleeing serfs and Astartes, sealing them into safe compartments or dooming them without distinction. Air roared from vents as non-essential sections were evacuated. On the capital ship's bridge, Iron Warriors shouted new firing solutions, trying to plot evasive patterns. Their cogitators spat out options. Their reactors struggled to feed both shields and engines. The mass of the oncoming wreck was too great, the distance too short. The cruiser hit like a thrown spear. Armor folded inward, great plates buckling. Gun decks imploded. The prow drove through the capital ship's outer hull and on, momentum carrying it deep into the vessel's interior. Compartments were crushed, their contents pulped. Fire blossomed along the fracture. For a brief, almost beautiful moment, the two ships were one tangled shape. Then both their drive cores went critical. The explosion tore a hole in the orbital battle. Light and radiation flared, washing over nearby craft, cooking sensors and blinding augers. Shock waves of particulate matter and wreckage punched outward, battering hulls. A cluster of smaller Iron Warriors escorts simply vanished, consumed by the expanding fireball. In the chaos, Loyalist ships regrouped. The outer bastion ring was gone or falling back in tatters. The debris cloud left behind was thick and lethal, but the Custodes had charted paths through worse. Their navigators plotted fresh courses through the drifting bones and iron, their spearships hugging the flagship's shadow. Slowly, methodically, the Loyalist formation pushed inward toward Vaelith itself. From the command observation blister, a Castian Valerian watched the world swell. Vaelith's hives were visible, even from orbit, the great stacks of its cathedra rising in uneven clusters, their tops already wreathed in fire. Warp light crawled over parts of the atmosphere, oily smears of color that had no place in real space. Lightning walked the cloud layers, striking at spire tips where the word-bearers' rituals burned brightest. Void dominance achieved, intoned a tech adept. Hostile fleet elements reduced to scattered nodes. Orbital bastions configured for planetary defense only. The path to descent is open. At cost, murmured one of the custodians at Valerian's side. A glance at the casualty hololiths confirmed it. Too many escort icons burned out. Too many support ships silent. Even the Carcharodons, whose ledger rarely acknowledged loss, had empty spaces in their formation. Cost is the currency of victory, Valerian said, and of failure. We will decide which this is. He opened a Vox channel. His voice carried to both his own fleet and the Carcharodons' vessels that still burned toward Vaelith. Prepare for planetary assault, he said. All craft. Designate primary targets as Hive continents Alpha through Delta. Custodes' spear landers will descend on Hive Vaelith Primus. The Sharks will take the rest. On his own Voxnet, Karen Mako listened and smiled with slow satisfaction. Below, the world burned already with word-bearer flames. Soon, it would burn with others. Invasion craft to launch stations, he growled. We go down. Dropods and gunships shuddered in their clamps. Grav engines whined as they cycled up. Bay doors opened to the void, revealing Vaelith's troubled face framed by fire and debris. The Void War had been won. The sea above Vaelith was now a graveyard of Iron Warriors dead and Loyalist wrecks. The next killing ground waited below. Vaelith's hives burned like votive candles in the dark. From high orbit, the picked relays showed whole continents encrusted with stone and steel. Hive spires thrusting up from a crust already split by industry and war. Rivers of light flowed along avenues, not from lumen lines or traffic, but from bodies, billions of them. Corrupted citizens enshrine red and work grey, press-ganged planetary defense men with ill-fitting flak harness, chain-collared slave soldiers in their tens of legions. They packed the plazas and transit ways, filled hab tiers until balconies bowed under the load. Seen from above, they were not random crowds, but meticulously arranged formations. Lines of bodies formed glyphs when viewed from the right angle. Coils of marching columns made spirals, eightfold knots, jagged circles. living script, written in flesh at the word-bearer's command. Every movement was a syllable. Every death would be a stroke of ink. Iron Warriors' fortresses sank their roots into that living text. Macro bastions rose at the edges of each hive complex, brutal towers of ferrocrete and adamantium, their walls layered with reinforcement grid and slaved void shield emitters. From each bastion, trenches spread outward like veins, linking to others in a vast, interlocking web. Railheads cut through the earth, chasms lined with track and cogitator-controlled switch points. Trains thundered along them, each a grinding snake of armored wagons bearing demon engines toward the front. Those engines were obscene parodies of cathedral architecture. Gun carriages as large as cathedra, crawling on titan legs of grown metal and bone. Hulls studded with gun ports and choked with gargoyle mouths, each exhaling warp fire. Magma cannon, their barrels sheathed in cooling coils, belched molten stone into the sky. Hell-forged artillery hunched on the ridges, their frames alive with crawling runes, their barrels fused into the flesh of bound things that screamed soundlessly whenever the weapons fired. On the Custodes flagship, the Strategium hololiths translated all that into ghostly schematics, glyphs and lines and pulsing threat runes. To any other command, the sheer scale of it might have induced paralysis. To the 10,000, it was simply the field of work. In the belly of the Carcharodons vessels, there was no hololithic contemplation. There was only descent. Drop pods hung in their clamps like shells in a predator's jaw. Their outer skin was scarred from 100 previous falls, each burn mark another world entered at speed. Inside, Astartes stood in restraint harnesses, maglocks holding armor against the brutal transition from void to sky. Their armor was pale grey, almost the color of bone, broken only by hazard striping and the dark bite of the shark jaw badge. The pods dropped in waves. Explosive bolts blew, clamps released, and gravity claimed the metal seeds. They fell away from their launch racks in staggered cascades, slam thrusters flaring as their guidance engines engaged. Thunderhawks roared out alongside them, gunship wings flexing, holds full of more killers. From the surface, the first wave looked like a meteor storm. The sky above Hive Valith Primus split into streaks of fire. Trails of burning plasma marked the paths of the descending pods, their shells glowing as friction clawed at them. Some were caught by the upward lash of hell-forged flak, ripped apart mid-fall, their contents cast out in burning fragments. Most endured, stabbing down through the lash of Iron Warrior's fire.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
They hit habstacks and shrine plazas with the force of falling godstones. Concrete exploded, steel buckled, whole floors collapsed around the impact sites. Shock waves rolled out along the streets, knocking men from their feet. The pod petals blew outward with a screech of tortured metal. Steam burst from within as internal atmospheres equalized. The Carcharodons walked out of the smoke. They moved in small kill packs, 4 or 5 warriors in each, spreading instinctively to cover all arcs. Bolters coughed, staccato and precise. Chainswords revved up, teeth snarling, their edges still stained with the work of prior wars. There was no roar of chapter mottos, no shouted hymns to the Emperor, only the tacknet, silent icons shifting as squads marked targets, routes, obstacles. The first cult mob to meet them was a tide of chanting men and boys, shrine brands burned into their foreheads, laser guns gripped in sweaty hands. At their head marched a word-bearer acolyte, his armor a crude imitation of his master's, lips moving as he recited a litany of promised elevation. He saw the pods land. He raised his hands, expecting loyalist guard, men he could break with a gesture and a promise of a new god. He got void sharks. The Carcharodons did not slow. They did not challenge or call for surrender or give warning. Bolter fire took the acolyte in mid-gesture, rounds punching through his breastplate and snapping his spine backward. The mob behind him hesitated for a single breath. That was all they had. The kill pack moved through them, like blades through water. To those on the ground, it looked like madness. To the Carcharodons, it was pattern. Every trigger pull was calculated. Every chainsword swing was a precise solution to a problem of space and time. Where the cultists were densest, frag and crack grenades sailed out, bursting in their midst, tearing bodies apart and turning screaming lines into heaps of debris. Where they tried to scatter, a Carcharodon would surge forward, chain teeth whining, and reap them, one after the other, in rapid succession. The plaza became a carpet of broken forms in the space of heartbeats. On one of the approach avenues, a scribist named Jason stood shaking behind the low wall of a requisitioned food stall and watched it happen. He had been a scribe in the lower administratum stacks once. He had recorded tithe levels and ship schedules, copying numbers from slate to parchment with cramped care. When the sermons had changed, he had listened. When the shrine wardens had called for volunteers to protect the Veiled One's festival, he had stepped forward, because that was what learned men were meant to do. When the collars came out, when the chains were fixed from neck to rail, he had not resisted. What was there to resist? It was all for the saint, they said, for the reliquary, for a better world. Then the sky had opened. He had thought, for a breath, that the Emperor had answered, that this was vengeance for the word-bearer's desecration, for the chains on his neck. The first Carcharodon he saw landed a dozen paces from him, armor still hissing with heat. The giant rose from the pod like a statue come to murderous life, white shark jaw marking stark against grey plate. Its lenses flared red as it scanned. It lifted its bolter. Jason opened his mouth to shout, to hail, to beg. The Carcharodon's first burst took the man standing beside him. The pilgrim's chest vanished in a spray that spattered Jason's face. He tasted blood and carbon, felt something hot and solid strike his cheek. It took him an instant to realize it was a tooth. The Astartes never even glanced his way. The kill pack was already moving on, stepping over the bodies as if they were rubble, firing in short, disciplined bursts into the densest parts of the mob. Chainswords bit into those who came too close, carving them apart with a wet grind. The storm of death rolled past. In its wake, the avenue was strewn with the fallen. Jason stood amid them, chains still linking his collar to the rail, hands trembling around the laser gun that no one had yet told him to fire. He stared after the departing giants, at the shark-tooth badges on their backs, at the casual way they dispatched any twitching form their boots brushed. He had thought the Emperor's servants would look like the statues in the cathedral, noble, sorrowful, stern. These did not. They looked like predators, stripped of ornament, their every movement a study in the practice of killing. He realized with cold clarity that if these were the Emperor's chosen, then there was little to choose between his God and the new one the word-bearers preached. Both wrote in blood. Both used men like ink. Overhead, Custodes' gravecraft cut through the flak. They came in higher and faster than the Carcharodons' drops, their hulls sleek, their engines built to move regardless of the protests of gravity or atmosphere. Coronas gunships and grav transports flew in tight spearhead formations, their prows angled toward a single point on the surface. The sprawling mass of High Valith Primus and the coordinates of the reliquary access beneath it. Iron Warrior's guns reached for them, macro cannon and flak batteries spitting shells and beams into the sky. The Custodes' flight path did not waver. Void and grav shields flared around the craft, overlapping fields absorbing and shunting the worst of the incoming fire away. Every so often, a transport would take a hit at just the wrong angle. One such gunship vanished in a burst of light as a magma round punched through its shields and detonated inside its hull. It simply ceased to exist, a smear of molten fragments falling in its place. Valerian felt the loss as a flicker across his internal command displays. He noted it, recalculated, and pressed on. Inside his own transport, he stood braced in the grav harness, helm sealed, spear mag locked to his gauntlet. Around him, Heteron Guard and Aquilon stood in patient stillness. At the rear of the compartment, the Null Maidens sat with their heads bowed, hands folded on their knees, as if the violent turbulence were a meditation bell. The world outside the view slit flickered from black to fire, then back again as they punched through cloud layers. Warp light crawled in the upper atmosphere, ugly stains that bled color into the cloud tops. Where it touched the gravcraft, it skittered and died, burned away by layered wards and the cold stubbornness of the Geller field built. Into the vessel's bones. "We are close," intoned the pilot's voice over the internal vox, as calm as if he were announcing a change of watch. The transport rolled, thrusters flaring, and dove straight into the teeth of the densest flak concentration over Hive Primus. Beneath them, a macro cathedral lay in ruins. The Dark Apostle's preparations had eaten at it from within, stripping it of icons that did not fit his new vision, turning its side chapels into ritual chambers or sacrificial pits. While the Iron Warriors had reinforced its foundations, the Word-bearers had hollowed its nave, carving new sigils into its pillars. When the Custodes transport dropped into its shattered atrium, the once beautiful structure was already half collapsed, its roof torn open by earlier bombardments. Statuary lay broken amidst piles of rubble. Altars lay overturned, their stone tops stained dark by recent offerings. The grav engines flared, arresting the transport's descent with brutal abruptness. The hull slammed down in a spray of dust and stone. Ramps dropped. The first custodian out met a clawed thing that had once been a man. Possession had thickened the Gal Vorbak warrior's limbs, distended his spine, cracked his armor to make way for the pushing growths of horn and bone. His helm had fused to his skull. Lenses sunk deep into a face now more than mask. Warp fire crawled in the air around his talons. He leaped, still roaring the last syllables of whatever sermonic murder speech Kor Talik had given him. The Null Maiden at the ramp's edge stepped forward. She said nothing. She never would again. Her mere presence was a wound in the fabric of the warp. The demonic fire that clung to the Gal Vorbak's claws guttered and died mid-leap, as if a hand had closed around it. For the length of that short hop, for those few meters of air between ramp and rubble, the possessed Astartes was only a man in twisted armor again. The custodian met him in that moment with an Adrathic burst. The beam from the destructor mounted under his spear's blade was invisible to normal sight, but its passage tore reality's skin aside for a heartbeat. Where it touched the Gal Vorbak's chest, matter simply failed. Armor, flesh, bone, all unmade, turned into drifting ions and a smell like storm air. The possessed warrior hit the ramp in two pieces that did not bleed, their ends smooth and smoking. "Advance," Valerian said. The Custodes and their silent shadows poured into the wreckage of the cathedral. Word-bearers elites met them among the broken pews and toppled statues. Silvered claws scraped across auramite, gouging lines that glowed faintly with lingering warp taint before the armor's internal wards burned it away. Blades met blades, each clash a thunderclap. Bolter rounds detonated at contact range, shattering stone and armor alike. For all their warp-swollen power, the demon-touched Astartes died quickly. A custodian's. Blade did not care for their faith. An Adrathic burst did not care for their patron's whispers. Where silvered talons sank, they might drag a single golden warrior down, buying a moment of satisfaction for the howling thing in their skull. Where guardian spears thrust, they ended something that had thought itself beyond ending. Bodies, human and post-human, piled among the icons of the old saint. While that duel of demigods raged in the reliquary's shadow, The Carcharodons turned their attention to the wider world. Once the initial shock of their landings had passed, they began to do what they had been brought here to do: erase. Karen Mako stood in the strategium of a commandeered hab spire, helm off, vox grill hissing softly as he watched the kill feeds. Jason's captive hab tier, and 1,000 more like it, appeared as segmented diagrams, each floor a block, each block a color. Red for enemy activity, amber for uncertain, green for empty. There were very few green blocks. Mako opened a channel to all forces assigned to Hive Secundus, a cluster of spires to the east of Hive Primus. Sector Gamma through Lambda, he said. Atmosphere vent, all levels. A human voice answered, thin and desperate, crackling over a hijacked Shrine Vox link. Marshal, there are loyal, there may be uncorrupted. The Shrine Wardens say some are hiding from the word-bearers in those tiers. If we give them a chance to declare themselves... Mako cut the channel. He turned to a tech serf, whose fingers danced nervously over the control lectern. Seal outer doors, Mako said. Cycle the vents, now. The serf swallowed. His eyes were wide, but he had served the Carcharodons long enough to know that hesitation had only one end. He keyed the commands. In Hive Secundus, bulkheads groaned as massive valves turned. Great intake fans reversed, whining louder as they fought the dense hive air. On one level, hab doors slammed shut of their own, a cord, locks engaging as if seized by unseen hands. Men and women inside rushed toward them, hammers and makeshift tools in hand, pounding in panic as they heard the change in the air. Lumen strips flickered. A thin wind began to stir, tugging at hair and clothing. In shrines and manufactoria, in sumps and transit tubes, chains rattled as slave soldiers tried to brace themselves against sudden suction. Cultists clutched icons, shouting litanies that were torn from their mouths. Some clawed at the collars around their throats, as if somehow the chain would save them. The wind became a roaring gale. Air rushed toward the great vent shafts at the hive's flanks, tearing lamps from ceilings, pulling unsecured objects from shelves. People lost their footing. Those closest to the vents hit the grills with bone-breaking force. Fingers jammed through the mesh as they tried to hold on. Others were dragged over them, pressed into screaming layers. The pressure differential did the rest. Atmosphere howled out of the hive in a torrent. Bodies followed, ripped from grips, flung down corridors, hurled out into the toxic exterior. Some struck the spire sides, bouncing and twisting. Others were carried clear, specks in the wind, to fall for long minutes before hitting the broken planes. On his vantage deck, Mako watched as whole hive-level diagrams turned from red and amber to black. "Mark as quiet," he said. Iron warriors tried to counter such measures with tactics they had used to hold worlds before. On the trench lines around their macro fortresses, they chained artillery crews to their weapons. Men with flensed backs and broken knees were bolted to their gun carriages so that they could not flee. Boys too young to have grown full beards were linked by collar to heavy stubber mounts. The Iron Warriors knew that some enemies would hesitate to fire on such sites, to saturate a position with ordnance when the bulk of the forms there were helpless slaves. The Carcharodons were not such enemies. Rad shells arced over the trenches, their trails glowing faintly green as they descended. When they burst, they released curtains of invisible death. Flesh that had already known hunger and abuse began to rot on the bone in seconds. Skin sloughed. Eyes bled down poisoned cheeks. Those strong enough to scream did so until their lungs broke. Phosphex bombs followed, thick fluid splashing over trench walls and into bunkers. It clung where it landed, burning with a hunger that could not be sated, crawling up surfaces as if seeking more living things to consume. Men tried to bat it away and found their hands on fire. They tried to roll in the mud and only spread it, becoming writhing torches. The rad would taint the ground for generations. The phosphex would cling for a very long time indeed. That was of no concern to the void sharks. They did not sow. They did not build. On a secure Vox channel, encrypted beyond the reach of mortal comprehension, Valerian's voice cut through the static of war. "Void Marshal," he said. Mako turned slightly, as if he could see the distant Custodes through the haze of ash and ruin. "Shield Captain," he answered. "Your methods are thorough," Valerian said. There was no censure in his tone, only assessment. "You vent hives with no attempt to sift cultist from citizen. You drench trenches in rad and phosphex when conventional ordnance would suffice." Mako's lips quirked. "Conventional ordnance leaves survivors," he said. "Survivors talk. Survivors gather. They birth new cults. They remember how their chains felt and look for new masters to break them. I am not here to liberate. I am here to erase." "Erasure destroys potential information," Valerian said. "There may be souls on Vaelith who know more of this reliquary than the word-bearers. Priests who were present at its founding. Tech adepts who tended its seals. Their minds would be of use." Mako looked out over a plaza choked with smoke, where his warriors moved through the wreckage of a broken shrine like grey ghosts. "Emptiness does not rebel," he said softly. "Emptiness holds no secrets for the enemy to steal. You are the Emperor's memory, Auramite. We are his silence." Valerian allowed a moment of quiet to pass. "Very well," he said at last. "Do as you were made to do. Just ensure that when we reach the vault, there is still a world left below us on which to stand." "If there is not," Mako said, "you will not need to worry about who walks its halls." The channel cut. Above high Vaelith Primus, the sky was splitting. The warp storm that had licked at the upper atmosphere since the reliquary's awakening now clenched into a fist. Clouds twisted into a spiral over the hive, drawn as if by some great drain. Lightning flickered within that spiral, not the white of natural storms, but a deep, arterial red. Each bolt that struck a spire left, crawling runes of fire along the stone, 8 pointed flares that did not fade. In the depths of the reliquary access tunnels, Dark Apostle Kor Talik stood at the center of a circle of chanting word-bearers and raised his hands. The living script of Vaelith's surface fed his work now. Every line of bodies, every sacrificed soul, every vented hive, every shrieked prayer turned in its death to his design. He drew that tide of horror and awe and despair down through the stone, shaping it, funneling it. He whispered to the buried construct with a lover's tongue. "Wake," he crooned. "Wake and see what has become of your master's realm. Wake and see how his children love him now." The reliquary shuddered. In the vault that had remembered the Emperor's hand, locks began to fail. Wards, already cracked by the initial ritual, splintered further under the weight of all that death. Light that had once been pure flared now with a stain at its heart. Outside in the storm, shapes moved within the red lightning. The battle for the surface of Vaelith raged on in tides of flesh and iron, but beneath it, something older than the legions and their quarrels stirred, and all the blood spilled above ran down toward it like rain. The way down began in a forgotten chapel. It lay far below the main nave of high Vaelith Primus, a hollowed pocket of stone reached only by a stair lost beneath debris and abandoned shrine stalls. Once, during the Great Crusade, it had been consecrated as a private oratory for a single visiting warlord. After the compliance, when the Emperor's work beneath Vaelith had been sealed and buried, the chapel had been locked and its location redacted from most records. Time and dust had done the rest. Now, under the bruise-colored light filtering down from the war-torn hives above, a Castian Valerian stood before its sealed door. The portal was plain compared to the Baroque excess of later imperial architecture. A single slab of plasteel and stone, its surface worked with a restrained, almost austere beauty. A stylized sunburst at its center. Along its edge, a frame of sigils that did not match any modern administratum lock markings. Custodians flanked Valerian, a wedge of Heteron Guard and Aquilon, their auramite plate dulled with ash, their cloak hems blackened from the fires above. Behind them, a handful of null maidens waited without comment, their blank faces turned toward the old door. Valerian reached into his belt pouch and drew out a small, heavy object. It was a lozenge of black metal, its surface etched with sigils in impossibly fine lines, like a maze within a maze. No servitor or tech adept had made it. The hand that had fashioned it had worn flesh once. Valerian pressed the cipher against the door, aligning its markings to those on the frame by memory rather than sight. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the sigils along the door's edge flared, not with any visible light, but with a sensation like the lifting of a weight. Mechanical locks clanked deep within the slab. Valerian felt a subtle shift under his palm, like the release of held breath. The door slid inward. Beyond lay a shaft descending into blackness. Old ward lights flickered to life along its walls, pale luminance waking after 10,000 years of sleep. Geomantic lines traced themselves in Valerian's inner display, linking this shaft to long dormant strata maps stored in his mind. "The Iron Warriors have not found this path," one of the Heteron murmured. "If they had," Valerian said, "we would be stepping over their corpses already." He turned his head slightly. "Nulls at the rear," he ordered. "Guardians in wedge, Aquilon at the flanks. We are a spear. We descend as one." They moved into the shaft. The descent was long and steep, the air growing hotter and denser as they sank through the hive's lower strata toward the planet's bones. Valerian walked at the point, his guardian spear balanced with unhurried grace, helm lenses picking out every irregularity in the walls. Ghostly overlays flickered in his sight, geomantic maps drawn in the age when the Emperor still walked among men. They showed tunnels and chambers that did not exist on any modern chart, shafts and nexus points laid down to service something never meant for common eyes. At 3 separate points, the old path intersected with Iron Warriors' works. The first was a transverse tunnel, chewed through the rock by siege drills, its walls still showing the scored marks of giant augers. It cut straight across the shaft, linking one bastion route to another. Iron Warriors had emplaced a kill box there, knowing that any force trying to reach the reliquary would likely seek the most direct route. Automated macro lasers hung in armored housings, their narrow barrels sweeping the shaft mouth in a slow, patient arc. Turrets infested with demon scrap code twitched on their mounts, tasting the air for the tang of gene-wrought flesh. Heavy bolter nests crouched behind slabs of plasteel and ferrocrete, their visual augers scanning for any break in the gloom. Valerian did not call a halt. "Forward," he said, voice calm over the internal vox. "Shield faces out, on my mark." As the lead custodian stepped into the intersection, the kill box woke. Last beams speared from the ceiling housings, coherent light so intense that the air around it turned to plasma. Macro bolts hammered from the flanks, the explosive shells turning rock into gouting clouds of dust and shrapnel. Demon-infested turrets shrieked in Binharic agony, vomiting streams of warp-tainted rounds that howled with spite even as they flew. Golden plate took the first storm. Void dispersal fields hummed along overlapped shields, bleeding off the worst of the thermal load. Last beams that would have carved battle tanks in half diffused across curved auramite, leaving only scorched trails and crackling. Energy. Macro shells burst against locked shields and upraised pauldrons, their fragments ringing off plate. Custodians answered with their own fire. Guardian spears spat disciplined bursts of bolt rounds, each shot placed with unerring precision. A single volley shredded one macro laser housing, blowing its emitter apart in a flare of white light. Another burst tore through a demon turret, its writhing flesh machine body bursting into a cloud of oily smoke and bone fragments. Storm bolters mounted on Aquilon plate roared in counterpoint, their higher caliber rounds chewing plasteel bunkers into jagged ruin. The entire kill box became a furnace, smoke and sparks and flying debris filling the air. Through it, the Custodes advanced with measured steps, cutting down every weapon that revealed itself, ignoring wounds that would have crippled lesser warriors. An Iron Warrior's heavy weapons cadre, deployed at the far end of the cross passage, brought crack missiles to bear. They were seasoned sons of Perturabo, their movements efficient and mechanically precise. They volleyed as one, warheads streaking toward the approaching Auramite. Two struck Valerian's shield. The first detonated on contact, blasting the shield from his arm, hurling him back a half step. Warning sigils flared across his vision, then stabilized. The second missile hit his chest plate and slid an inch before its shaped charge found purchase and blew. Heat and force hammered into him. Armor plates creaked, internal braces flexed. An ordinary man would have been paced. Valerian staggered, felt the impact pass through him like a blow from a titan's hammer. He did not fall. He raised his spear one-handed and shot the missile team. One by one they fell. Each struck center mass reactive rounds detonating within ceramite, turning gene-forged organs and bone into mist. Their bodies clattered from the gun nest, weapons falling silent. Silence did not last long. Further along, a different kind of howl began. The second intersection was saturated with warp sound. Even before the Custodes reached it, Valerian could feel the change. The air grew thick, not in any physical sense, but in the way his armor's wards woke and hummed. The psychic noise of the surface battle was distant here, muted by the layers of stone. But in this passage, something was attempting to breed a new storm. Word-bearer sorcerers had chosen the junction as their stand. They had carved their own marks into the walls, slashing over the older, subtler geomantic sigils laid down in the Emperor's time. 8 pointed stars of scored stone, columns of scripture in a curling, blasphemous script. The rock itself wept blood in thin lines where their knives had cut too deep. They stood in a semicircle across the tunnel, crimson armor banded with script, horned helms flaring with witchlight. Warp fire crawled between their outstretched hands, coiling into glyphs and chains, forming shapes that were almost faces. As the Custodes approached, the sorcerers raised their voices, chanting in a language that had burned cities. "See how they come," one of them laughed, wrapped in old pride. "Bring them to their knees, show them the truth of the Pantheon." The warp howled in answer. Demonic presences pressed at the thin skin of reality, attracted by the scent of blood and the promise of worthy flesh. Clawed shadows leaned forward, eager to step through. Ragged wings beat at the air in unseen tempests. Then the Null Maidens entered the intersection. They moved up from the rear at Valerian's curt hand signal, their steps light, their faces as empty as ever. They did not raise weapons. Their hands were bare. Their presence rolled ahead of them like a tide of absence. The warp recoiled. The howling cut off mid-note. Glyphs of fire guttered and went dark, like candles snuffed by invisible fingers. The shapes pressing at the thin veil suddenly found nothing to grip but smooth glass. The demons screamed, not in triumph but in frustration, their voices dragged back into the depths they had clawed from. The word-bearers felt it like sudden suffocation. Spells died half-formed on their tongues. Runes that had burned across their armor faded, leaving only scorched paint. One sorcerer staggered, hands going to his helm as if to tear it off, needing fresh air that was not there. His eyes, behind the lenses, were wide and suddenly very human. "What is—" he began. A guardian spear went through his chest, pinning him to the wall like an insect. The Custodes did not waste the opening. Without warp shields, without demonic patronage whispering half-seen counters into their ears, The sorcerers were just post-human men in armor. Dangerous, yes. Trained, yes. But they stood before something older and nearer to the throne's flame than any of them had ever been. They died in swift succession. A blade beneath the arm, a bolt to the visor, a misericordia slipping between plastron plates. Their blood stained the carved sigils at their backs, joining the older hieroglyphs in a new unintended script. As the last fell, a null maiden watched his body twitch, her expression unchanged. Whatever he had promised his flock, whatever vision of new gods he had preached, it meant nothing in the quiet air around her. The warp did not even get his soul. Her mere presence had deafened reality to its claim. Beyond the sorcerer's last stand, the passages changed. The rough rock of hive strata gave way to worked stone that was older than the hives themselves. The ceiling lifted subtly, the walls smoothed. Torch brackets appeared, empty but uncorroded, their placement too precise to be merely practical. The floor slabs underfoot were of a stone that did not match any Vaelith quarry. Valerian recognized the shift. They were in the reliquary's outer halls now. The architecture spoke of pre-heresy imperial design, but there was a restraint here that had never reached the gaudy temple builders of later centuries. Columns were plain, their proportions exact, their surfaces unbroken save for a few incised lines that hinted at pattern without ever resolving into one. Doorways were framed by geometric motifs that teased the eye into trying to find meaning. The stone itself was wrong. As the custodians moved, sigils underfoot brightened and dimmed in response to their passing. Lines migrated across the slabs, shifting into new shapes, then fading. Statues stood in alcoves, hooded figures in simple robes, their faces hidden by cowls. Valerian glanced at one face as he passed and, for an instant, saw features he knew reflected there. Not his own, another's, a face from memory, long dead. One of the Emperor's other servants, cut down on a distant wall long ago. He looked again and found only blank stone. The null maidens made the place quiet. Whatever latent psychoreactive properties the stone had, whatever. Echoes of the Master's old work still clung to it, their pariah aura pressed flat. The warp scent faded, leaving the halls clear and cold. Even the migrating sigils slowed, as if reluctant to move in the presence of such denial. At the heart of the complex, before a gate of black metal that drank the light, the defenders stood. Dark Apostle Cor Talek waited at the center, his armor slick with old blood and new scripture. The red of his plate had darkened with use. The words etched into it layered 3 and 4 deep in places, overlapping until they formed a new, almost illegible skin. His helm's horns curved back like a crown of bone. A crozius, its head an 8-pointed star, rested in his hand. Around him stood his chosen word-bearers, a ring of elite brethren whose bodies bore the subtle marks of long familiarity with the warp. Their movements were a fraction too fluid, their heads turning with almost animal quickness. Some had claws where fingers had been, others had eyes that glowed with an inner ember-like light. Beyond that ring, iron warriors held firing positions. They had thrown up barricades of stone and metal, rough but effective. Heavy bolters and autocannons were emplaced behind them. Melter teams crouched in cover, their weapons trained on the corridors through which the Custodes would have to advance. Servo arms twitched above some iron warriors' backs, tools and weapons ready to act in a dozen different directions. At the foremost barricade stood warsmith Damakos Brak. He wore his rank with the solid, unadorned pride of Perturabo's sons. His armor was grey and hazard black, the chevrons on his shoulders worn but clear. His helm was off, revealing a face more iron than flesh. Augmetic plates replacing cheek and jaw, cables running from his skull into the sockets of his powered harness. Servo arms unfolded from his back like a spider's limbs, each ending in a different implement of war. A claw, a hammer, a plasma cutter, a spike. He watched Valerian's approach with a hard, measuring gaze. "You found one of the old paths," he said at last, his low Gothic edged with the clipped cadence of Olympian dialect. "I wondered if your master would have had the wit to leave himself a back door." Valerian stopped at the edge of the last bend, his host fanning out behind him, shields interlocked, spears ready. "He does not need doors," the custodian said. "He has us." Kortalek laughed, a rich, rolling sound that echoed strangely in the reliquary hall. "Hear that?" he said to his followers. "Hear how they still talk, as if he walks among them, as if he were not a half-dead husk drooling light onto his throne." His vox grill tilted toward Valerian. "You are far from your palace, Golden One," he said, "far from your walls and your comfort of familiar shadows. Here in the deep places, beneath a world that has heard my sermons, beneath a sky painted with the blood of your Imperium, your age is over. The Pantheon rises, the corpse's dream fails. That vault behind me will be ours, or broken. Either serves." Valerian regarded him for a heartbeat. "You mistake endurance for decay," he said, his tone almost bored. "You mistake your own noise for the end of the storm. The Emperor's realm has burned before. It still stands. You and your legion have been screaming in the dark for long lifetimes, Dark Apostle. The 10,000 still exist. We still walk. That is proof enough of his will." Kortalek's fingers tightened on his crozius. "You will not always," he said. "There will come a day when even you lie in dust." "Perhaps," Valerian said, "but not this day." He lifted his spear. Iron warriors' gunners tensed, word-bearers' claws flexed. The air between the two forces crackled, warp echoes clashing with the disciplined hum of ancient wards. "Kill them!" Damakos Brak snarled. The last battle for Valeth's heart began in a storm of fire and motion. Iron warriors' guns spoke first. Autocannon rounds howled down the hall, tearing chunks from the stone. Heavy bolter shells streaked toward the golden line, detonating in gouts of shrapnel. Crack and melter shots followed, the former punching into armor with brute force, the latter reducing surface layers to bubbling slag. The Custodes met that hail with raised shields and angled plate. Even they could not pass through it untouched. A heteron on Valerian's right took a crack round square in the shoulder. The blast tore his pauldron apart and punched through the joint beneath. His sword arm spun away, still clamped around his weapon. He staggered again, then roared and pushed forward, his remaining hand bringing his spear up to block another fusillade. A second volley of melter fire struck him full on, reducing his chest to a collapsing mass of glowing metal. This time he fell, his body crashing to the stone. Another custodian stepped over him. They advanced at a steady pace, never running, never breaking formation. Guardian spears raised, they fired in short, devastating bursts. Bolt rounds smashed into Iron Warriors' bunkers, detonating inside, blowing weapons and operators alike into red mist. Where the defenders ducked behind cover, grenades arced in to flush them out, the blasts turning hiding places into open air. Word-bearers' elites surged in from the flanks, seeking to close the distance, to bring their demonic grafts to bear. A clawed warrior leaped, his limbs stretched with warp-granted reach, blade fingers extended toward a custodian's helm. A Null maiden stepped past the custodian's shoulder. The Gal Vorbak-style warrior hit the ground in front of her, all his unnatural grace gone. For a heartbeat, his body spasmed, armor twitching as the inner thing fought to maintain its hold. Then, his demonic patron's grip tore away like wet cloth. The warp fire in his eyes went out, leaving only confusion and sudden, mortal terror. The custodian behind her cut him in two. Elsewhere along the line, another word-bearer tried to call down a bolt of empiric lightning, his crozius raised high. The first syllables of the invocation died in his throat as one of the pariahs turned her gaze on him. His jaw worked soundlessly, like a fish drowning on dry land. His hand trembled. No power came. A spear point took him in the chest, lifting him from his feet and nailing him to the doorframe behind him. Around the gate, the melee thickened. Custodes and traitor elites crashed together, blows falling with the force of falling masonry. A single strike from a guardian spear or a word-bearer's demonic blade could shear an arm or a head from its owner. A single misstep could mean being dragged down under a mass of clawed hands and pounding fists. Iron Warriors' gun lines kept up a ceaseless fire, pouring round after round into any gap in the Golden Wall, heedless of the proximity of their allies. They were willing to chew their own in order to grind the Custodes down. Slowly, bodies piled high. Even a custodian could only take so many direct hits from crack and melter before his plate failed. One Aquilon, his armor already cracked from earlier battles, took 3 melter shots to the torso in quick succession. His internal systems screamed warning. Valves failed. Superheated gases vented inside his suit. He kept walking for 5 paces more, Stormbolter still firing, before his frame collapsed, collapsing like a burned-out shell. His brothers stepped over him. Their advance did not pause. At the lip of the last ramp before the gate, Valerian and Damocos Brack found one another. Their eyes met over the carnage, the warsmith's cold, machine-edged gaze locking with the custodian's steady calm. There was no need for words. Valerian surged forward, spear-lancing. Brack met the thrust with a sweep of his chain axe, catching the tip on the whirring teeth, sparks flying. The impact jarred up both their arms. Servo arms arced over the warsmith's shoulders, clearing obstructions, smacking aside debris and stray limbs. One slammed into Valerian's shield, denting it inward. "You are late," Brack grunted, driving forward. "You should have come in the Long War's first years, when you still mattered." Valerian twisted, letting the chain axe scream past his chest, its teeth scraping auramite and leaving bright gouges. "We come when we choose," he said. He turned the movement into a thrust, the spear's blade snapping out, aimed at the gap between Brack's pauldron and his breastplate. Servo arms crossed, catching the shaft, but the force of the blow shoved Brack back a half step. The stone under his boots cracked. The warsmith responded with cold, practiced brutality. He dropped his center of gravity, let the next spear swing past over his helm, then lunged in close, chain axe cutting in a short, vicious arc for Valerian's knee joint. Jahl, custodian pivoted, armor servos straining. The axe bit into his greave instead, tearing through the layered plating, sending shards of auramite spinning. Pain flared along Valerian's leg, but it was a distant thing. His body was more machine than meat in all the ways that mattered. He bore the damage, adjusted his stance, and brought his spear down like a guillotine. Brack was old. He had survived more wars than most planets had seasons. His instincts saved him from decapitation, his head jerking aside so that the blade carved a trench across his cheek instead of removing it. Flesh and augmetic plate gave way. Cables snapped, an eye lens shattered, spraying sparks and fluid. A servo arm hooked around the spear haft, trying to wrench it aside. Valerian let it, stepped in with his offhand, and slammed his misericordia up under the warsmith's gorget. The short blade slid between armor plates with contemptuous ease. Its tip punched into the thick wiring and half-forgotten organs beneath. Brack gasped, not in fear, but in sudden, furious disbelief. "You are only a man," he snarled. Valerian drove the blade deeper. "I am his," he said. "That is enough." He tore the misericordia free and reversed his spear in one motion, smashing the butt of the haft into Brack's helm. The warsmith's skull cracked against the inner lining. His knees buckled. Servo arms flailed, then went slack as control signals died. Damakos Brak fell at the foot of the gate he had sworn to hold. Kortalek, midway through a shouted exhortation to his remaining followers, saw the warsmith drop. For a heartbeat, the sight actually checked his flow of words. Then he laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound. "So falls iron," he called. "So breaks stone. You see, my brothers? All these old certainties crumble. Their generals die, their walls fail. Only the word endures." He turned, Crozius raised, seeking to draw on the warp one last time, to call down some final, spectacular damnation. Lightning crawled along the head of his weapon, purple and sickly. The air around him trembled. A null maiden stepped into his aura. She had been working her way through the melee, unremarked, shielded by the greater presence of her brothers. Now she came into the open, her shaven head lifted, her eyes fixed on the dark apostle. The lightning on the Crozius sputtered and went out. Kortalek felt a sudden gut-wrenching absence. The voices that had whispered in the back of his mind since he had first knelt on the decks of Lorgar's flagship fell silent. The reassuring pressure of his patron, that constant, oily hand on his soul, vanished. He was alone in his own skull for the first time in centuries. He choked, unheard syllables catching in his throat. "No," he managed. "No, you do not understand. I am chosen. I am—" A custodian spear took him from the side. The blade punched through his rib plates, angling up, breaking ceramite and bone. It emerged from the other side of his chest, in a fountain of dark blood and shredded organs, lifting him from his feet. His hands scrabbled at the haft, fingers clawing for purchase. His followers saw their prophet jerk and stiffen. They saw his Crozius fall from his grip. They saw the warrior who had spoken so eloquently of transcendence and rebirth, now simply another corpse pinned to a weapon. For some, that sight broke something inside them more thoroughly than any null aura could. Kortalek's helm lenses dimmed. Whatever words he had meant to end with were never spoken. In the silence around the null maiden, no god heard him. No demon reached out. He died as a man dies, lungs filling with blood, heart ruptured, consciousness narrowing to a pinprick, and then darkness. With the apostle down and the warsmith dead, the will of the defense fractured. Some word-bearers fought on in blind rage, howling oaths to an empty heaven. Others faltered, steps slowing, their eyes flicking between the corpse of their leader and the implacable golden line advancing. A few tried to fall back, seeking side passages, only to find them already choked with bodies or blocked by collapsed stone. The Iron Warriors, true to form, did not rout. They died where they stood, firing until their weapons were empty, then clubbing with the stocks. When they fell, they did so with their faces turned toward the enemy, as if daring the universe to admit it had needed such effort to bring them down. In time, even that stubborn resistance thinned. The last volleys echoed away down the stone halls. The last chainsword whined, then cut out with a stutter as its teeth caught and jammed. The last breath rattled from the last traitor throat. Silence fell upon the approach to the gate. It was not a natural quiet. War had its own kind of noise, even in pause, the background groan of cooling metal and settling rubble, the distant echo of other battles. Here, in the reliquaries, threshold, the presence of the null maidens magnified the hush into something deeper. The warp sounds that had roared above and below were cut off entirely, leaving only the mundane, the scrape of armor, the drip of blood, the harsh breathing of warriors who rarely needed to breathe hard. Valerian stood before the gate. Up close, the black metal surface was smooth as polished glass. No seam was visible, no keyhole, only a faint pattern of incised lines, forming a geometry that hurt the eye to follow. His helm's autosenses tried to trace it, then returned nothing, as if the lines existed in more directions than three. "The last seal," one of the tech adepts murmured, his voice husky with awe and old fear. "It bears his hand." Valerian lifted the cipher lozenge once more. It was warm now, as if responding to something beyond the thin air of the hall. He pressed it against the gate. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the patterns on the metal shifted. Lines that had seemed purely decorative flared with pale light, aligning themselves around the point of contact. A pulse ran out from the cipher across the surface, echoing through unseen channels. Deep within the world, something answered. The gate unmade itself, not with the clank and grind of moving parts, but with a quiet, almost polite folding. The black surface rippled, its solidity melting away like oil on water. It receded into the frame, leaving an opening into a space that glowed with a light that was not any color men had words for. Valerian stepped through. The chamber beyond was vast, yet its dimensions refused to stay fixed in his perception. One moment it seemed barely larger than a throne room. The next it opened above and below into something like infinity. The walls were not walls, but planes of luminous energy, layered upon one another in intricate, shifting patterns. Lines of force arced between them, each trace too complex for any cogitator to map. At the chamber's heart hung the construct. It was a knot of geometry and light, anchored to points that did not correspond to any simple physical anchor. It floated over a chasm of nothing, threads of radiance extending from it in all directions, vanishing into the unseen. Some of those threads pulsed faintly, as if they reached out beyond Velith, beyond even this system, to touch distant, hidden points in the void. Others were dark, severed, hanging limp. There was no warp stench here, no hint of demonic presence. The Null Maiden's aura pressed against the construct and found nothing to snuff. This was something else, something born of the Emperor's will, wrought not by pact, but by comprehension. A web of paths, one of the Heteron murmured, awed despite himself. A road through walls the warp cannot break. Or a weapon. Valerian felt it even without the Adept's muttered readings. This was a thing that could move armies in silence between the stars, bypassing storms and blockades. It could stitch together worlds with invisible arteries. Or, if turned, it could drag those worlds into some waiting abyss. Behind him, the surviving Custodians spread out along the threshold, weapons low but ready. Their armor was scarred and blackened. Their cloaks were torn. Blood, red and darker, crusted their plates. They looked upon the construct with the steady, assessing gaze of men who had seen much and carried more. "The Emperor made this," one tech adept whispered. "In the time before terror burned, before the palace walls were raised to the sky, he intended..." He trailed off, lacking the words for what intentions might have driven such a work. Valerian's thoughts flicked back to the shadowed vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, to the concealed ledgers of the Shadow Keepers, to the Tribune's flat tone as he had spoken of the protocols governing compromised works of the Master. He knew what they would say, if he asked. He also knew what it would cost to try, to claim this thing, to stabilize it, to cleanse it utterly of any touch the word-bearers had laid upon its outer seals. Years, perhaps, lives beyond counting. A permanent garrison of his brothers, tied to a single rock at the edge of a segmentum, forever guarding one more doorway in an Imperium already riddled with them. Behind him, far above, the war still raged. The Carcharodons were emptying hives. The Iron Warriors' fortresses were burning. Velith's crust shook with the strain of the reliquaries awakening. Valerian stood on the threshold of a piece of the Emperor's lost design and weighed his options. Claim it, or burn it. He felt the weight of 10,000 years on his shoulders, like another layer of plate. His fingers tightened on his spear haft. "We have a choice," he said quietly, more to himself than to any other. "Not of whether this endures, That was decided when the word-bearers bled this world. Our choice is only whose hands such things are allowed to pass through, and how briefly. He turned, helm lenses glowing in the strange light, and met the gaze of the nearest Null Maiden. "Prepare the charges," he said. "Bring me the protocols of unmaking." The reliquary's light pulsed, as if in response, as if some remnant of its maker's will waited to see which path his chosen would take. Vaelith died from the top down. Clouds burned first. The storm that had coiled above High Vaelith Primus turned from bruised red to a color like old blood left too long in a bowl. Lightning walked its belly in jagged veins, each stroke hotter than the last, until the upper atmosphere itself caught. From orbit, the fleets watched sheets of fire spread along the cloud bands, rolling outward from the central vortex. At the edges of that storm, other lights bloomed. Firestorms, kindled where Carcharodons strike craft, had sown incendiary munitions with deliberate malice. Whole swathes of the sky over the secondary hives turned into rippling furnaces, the air itself turned to fuel. In selected hive clusters, darker tools were used. Virus warheads were old monsters, their use curtailed and catalogued under seals that only the highest echelons of the throne could break. On the decks of a single grey-hulled vessel, those seals had been broken. The first warhead fell on Hive 4th Primus. It came in on a shallow trajectory, its shell designed not to survive impact, but to burst at a precise altitude above the Hive's crowning spires. For a moment it was a streak of light, easily mistaken for another falling drop pod. It detonated in silence. From the ground, there was no sound, no flash, only a brief, shimmering distortion in the air above the Hive's spine. A fine drizzle of unseen motes descended, carried by the convection currents rising from the Hive's own heat. They settled on towers and spires, on hab roofs and shrine banners, on the exposed skin of those who had come onto balconies to watch the sky, burning. The motes woke in contact with warmth. In lungs, in eyes, on tongues, they bloomed, their engineered patterns unfolding like obscene flowers. Organs that had known the slow decay of a hard life now met a different kind of ending. Cells at the edges of each mote's reach turned traitor, devouring their neighbors, breaking down tissue at speed. Systems failed, one after another, as if some unseen hand had taken a blade to the skeins of a living tapestry. In the streets and on the shrine steps, men and boys and chain-collared soldiers fell where they stood. No blood, no glorious wounds. They dropped, limbs suddenly boneless, mouths opening in soundless, breathless attempts to scream. Each body carried the contagion further, contact spreading it along the tightly packed ranks. Within a very short span, Hive 4th Primus was quiet. Controlled cyclonic detonations followed. Not the full, ravening exterminatus protocols that would have torn Vaelith apart in an instant, but measured hammer blows aimed at key points. Deep seismic charges cracked the crust beneath some Hive foundations, sending shock waves through already stressed strata. Reactor cores in others were driven past the brink with well-placed lance strikes, their containment fields collapsing, unleashing localized suns that vaporized their host structures and bored molten shafts toward the mantle. From above, the effect was of a world being unmade by careful degrees. Atmospheric layers shredded, weather systems collapsed, shorelines boiled. The fragile skin of life that had encrusted Vaelith since the first colonists had set down was being peeled away, piece by piece. On the ground, Karen Mako walked through what remained. He moved with a small retinue of his most savage companies, grey armor blackened by soot and dust. The shark jaw badges on their pauldrons were streaked with overlaid kill marks, some old, some fresh. They advanced through a landscape that only hours before had been a Hive approach, and was now a charred plain, studded with broken ferrocrete and twisted rebar. The Carcharodons did not pick their path carefully. They walked over bodies, crushed through the wreckage of hab pods, waded through drifts of ash that had once been men. The air was still hot enough in places to warp vision, heat shimmer rising in waves from the rubble. Distantly, reactors boomed as they died. "Contact," murmured one of Mako's lieutenants over the TACnet, his voice a low rumble. "Trader plate, ahead, heat signatures, few." They found them clustered in the partial shadow of a fallen macro statue. Word-bearers and iron warriors together, armor scorched and cracked, survivors of a position that had been lashed by firestorm and shell. They had dragged themselves here, seeking the dubious shelter of the toppled saint's stone form, its head shattered, its outstretched hand buried to the wrist in rubble. One word-bearer raised his bolt pistol as the Carcharodons came into view, his lens flaring with a last stubborn hatred. He tried to speak, lips moving inside his broken helm grill, perhaps to spit a curse, perhaps to intone a final scrap of scripture. Mako shot him through the visor without breaking stride. The survivors realized then that there would be no parley. Some tried to run, limping, bleeding. Others chose to charge, knowing the only end worth anything was one that came with a weapon in hand. A few, iron warriors to the core, simply lifted their guns and fired until the incoming bolts tore them apart. The Carcharodons cut them down. There was no artistry to it, no ritual beyond the most basic acknowledgement of a kill properly made. Bolter fire, precise and economical, took limbs and heads. Chainswords finished the crippled. One iron warrior, half his torso blown away, tried to drag himself toward a fallen heavy bolter, leaving a trail of dark fluid on the ground. A Carcharodon put a boot on his back, pinned him, and drove a combat blade through the exposed spine with a single efficient thrust. Prisoners were rare. Those taken were not bound for cells or interrogation theaters. They were used as wayfinders, where the hive maps were too warped to be trusted, forced ahead under guns to trigger traps or lead the way through half-collapsed corridors. Once their usefulness ended, so did they. Mako did not waste words on them. He did not waste hate. They were obstacles, tools, then carrion. There were still pockets of organized resistance, cut off from their command structure, watching their bastions fall silent one by one. The remaining iron warriors had drawn back to defend what they considered truly important. Around the macro-reactor spires that fed the last functioning fortress complex, they dug in. These were titanic constructs, towers of adamantium and reinforced stone as tall as lesser hives, their cores drilling down into the planet's mantle to drink its heat, coolant pipes as wide as mag, rails snaked from them, feeding power to guns and shields. If those reactors could be held, some semblance of control over the surrounding region could be preserved. Iron warriors excelled at last stands. They turned the spire's lower levels into layered kill zones, each level a ring of emplacements and fallback points. Heavy weapon teams manned firing ports carved into the reactor casing itself. Artillery pieces were dragged into position along access ramps, their barrels depressed as far as they would go to cover approaches. Minefields were laid in mathematical patterns, overlapping, predictable only to the warsmiths who had designed them. What they were not prepared for was the angle of attack. Coronis gunships came in low and fast, hugging the ground, their grav engines kicking up dust and debris. They flew under the arcs that the iron warriors had anticipated, skimming trenches and collapsed hab stacks to bring themselves into the shadow of the spires. In the lead craft, Aquilon Terminators stood braced, harnesses locked, storm bolters mag clamped to their gauntlets. The roar of the engines barely registered through their helm filters. The data feeds from orbit did. Reactor Spire Alpha, came Valerian's voice over the encrypted channel. Primary Iron Warriors concentration, kill their spine. The gunships flared their engines, killing forward momentum in an instant. Hatches blew. The Aquilon dropped into vertical shafts, into access caverns, into the exposed inner spaces of the spires themselves. They landed among Iron Warriors' fire teams in the space of a breath. The defenders had dug in for a siege. They got a butchery. Storm bolters thundered, each double-barreled weapon vomiting rounds at a rate that turned corridors into meat grinders. Autocannon crews, so proud of their overlapping fields of fire, were wiped out before their gunners could fully swing their barrels to bear. Missile teams died with their launchers still on their shoulders, caught mid-turn. In the cramped confines of the spire's lower levels, the Custodes' heavy plate was a decisive advantage. Shrapnel and stray rounds that might have maimed in the open clawed at them and slid away. In return, every strike of a power fist, every sweep of a blade, broke more than one foe. In minutes, the spire's lower galleries were cleared. Iron Warriors pushed in from higher levels, trying to force the intruders back down toward the surface, but found themselves ground between the Astras and the storm of fire from the Coronis gunships outside. Orbital pict feeds recorded the macro reactor's defenders dying in dense clusters, their bodies piling against the very barricades they had built. In a smashed transit tunnel not far from one of those reactor spires, a word-bearer centurion dragged himself over rubble, leaving a trail of fluids. His helm was gone, exposing a face that had once been handsome in a predatory way, and was now a ruin of cuts and charred flesh. One arm ended in a tangled mess at the elbow. His armor's chest plate bore a crater where a shell had struck at close range, the edges fused into hard, bubbled shapes. His Vox grill still worked. He clutched it to his mouth with his remaining hand, dragging air into ruined lungs, forcing words out past the blood. "In the name of Lorgar," he gasped, voice rasping over wide-band Vox, carried to any shrine receiver or Iron Warrior's gain still listening. Know that Valith burns not because their corpse god is strong, but because he fears. He fears what we woke. He fears... A shadow fell over him. He looked up into a mask of gold. The custodian said nothing. He stepped down, the weight of his boot settling with casual certainty on the centurion's throat. The traitor's eyes widened. His hand twitched toward a fallen bolter, then away. His Vox grill crackled with a half-formed word. The Misericordia punched down, sliding through the gorget and into the soft meat beneath. The Vox cut out with a wet hiss. The centurion's limbs spasmed once, then lay still. Whatever last testament he had hoped to broadcast to the galaxy ended under that boot, never to be written into any scripture but the Custodes' internal record of another job completed. Below all of this, deep in the reliquary's heart, a Castian Valerian stood before the construct and spoke across impossible distance. The astropathic burst from terror was brief and silent. No flaring of raw psychic agony here. Not in this place. Not in the presence of the Null Maidens. The channel the Shadowkeepers used for such communication was old and precise, a thread of thought encoded in ways the warp could barely taste. It unfolded in Valerian's mind as a simple thing. The impression of the Tribune's voice, the echo of the Shadowkeep vault, the taste of dust and locked steel. "Report," that inner voice said. Valerian answered with images, the construct hanging over its unseen anchoring points, the warped sigils on the outer halls, the corpses of the word-bearers and Iron Warriors, the storm overhead, seen through broken stone. He let the Tribune feel the faint stain that clung to the reliquary's frame now, the mark of warp fingers that had tried and failed to close fully around it. The response was clear, the protocol old. If a construct wrought by the Master for the Throne, or its hidden paths has tasted the warp, the Tribune's thought cut back, calm as always. It is no longer a tool, it is a liability. Shadow Edict, such works must not endure. You have the means, you have the authority. Unmake it. The contact faded. Valerian opened his eyes. Around him, the chamber glowed with its own unfathomable light. The construct pulsed faintly, as if aware. as if listening. He turned to the tech adepts who had accompanied his spearhead. "You heard?" he said. They bowed, mechadendrites twitching. "We have the devices," one said. Adrathic charges, calibrated to sever the threads of its manifestation. Grav imploders to crush the physical anchor points and collapse the surrounding matter. These are weapons forged for the unmaking of things born in the Dark Age, for those artifacts even the Master chose to discard. "Place them," Valerian said. "Pattern 3. No errors." They moved with a haste that was somehow still precise. Adrathic devices were deceptively small, each a sealed cylinder etched with complex sigils, their cores containing engineered principles that could turn matter's own existence against itself. Grav imploders were larger, boxy units whose internal engines could momentarily distort the pull of mass in ways that collapsed structures into points. Custodians set them on the invisible thresholds around the construct, their armor runes interfacing with the device's machine spirits, feeding them targeting solutions. Each charge was secured with care, its arming sequence left at the final stage, awaiting only Valerian's word. One of the younger custodians, his armor newer, his scars fewer, watched as an Adrathic cylinder sealed with a soft chime. "Shield, Captain," he said, voice low, carried only to Valerian over a tight beam. "Permission to speak?" "Granted," Valerian said without looking away from the construct. "We burn his work," the younger warrior said. "Our master's design, a path he walked with his own hands. We erase it as if it were some traitor artifact. Does that sit well with you?" Valerian studied the glowing knot. "The Emperor made many weapons," he said. "Some he used, some he sealed, some he abandoned when their price became too high. We were made to stand watch over all those choices. That includes knowing when to bury even his tools." He turned his gaze to the younger custodian. "We are not hagiographers," he said. "We are not priests to pretend he never erred, or that every plan he conceived must be preserved in amber. We are his hands as much as his shield. If he had not wished some things unmade, he would not have given us the means." The younger custodian held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Understood," he said. "If it eases you," Valerian added, "remember this. We do not erase his work entirely. We remember it. We write it into the vaults under the palace. We carry the knowledge. We burn only the part that others might touch." He raised his hand. "On my mark," he said over the internal net. "Prepare to arm." Above, the war reached a brief, terrible plateau. The Carcharodons, having broken the last organized resistance and set the hives to burning, began their withdrawal. Vox orders cut across the ruin. "All ground elements," Mako growled, "return to extraction points. Leave what breathes. Let the world finish them." Thunderhawks and lighter craft descended through the smoke, landing on any level surface not currently collapsing. Carcharodons boarded in disciplined clumps, armor scorched, weapons blackened. No one carried trophies. There was no space left in the ossuaries for Valith. On the outskirts of Hive Primus, Jason the Scribist, half mad and half dead, watched a gunship lift away from a cracked plaza, its engines kicking ash into his face. He reached up a hand as if to hail it, as if someone aboard might see and care. No one did. He coughed, lungs seared by the poisons now creeping through the air, and sagged back against the broken statue he had crawled to. Around him, other survivors twitched and stilled, their prayers and curses lost under the deep groan rising from the earth. Valerian lowered his hand. "Arm," he said. In the reliquary, the charges woke. Adrathic cores spun up, their internal engines beginning to unravel the bonds that held matter together in the construct's immediate vicinity. Grav imploders whined as their fields built, drawing on the latent power of Valith's own mantle. The construct reacted. For a heartbeat, its light flared. Threads that had been dark pulsed, as if reaching for something beyond the chamber. Some tried to anchor themselves more deeply into the surrounding stone. Others lashed blindly, striking sparks against the Null Maiden's deadening presence and burning out. "Now," Valerian said. The sequence ran. Adrathic charges fired in a pattern that took account of the construct's shifting geometry, each pulse timed to strike a different aspect of its manifestation. To mortal sensors, nothing notable happened. No flash, no sound. To the fabric of reality, it was as if knives had been drawn across threads previously thought unbreakable. The construct's connections to whatever lay beyond snapped. In that instant, the grav imploders engaged fully. Fields inverted. The gentle, constant pull that had held Valith's interior steady for so long went mad in a confined volume. The construct, robbed of its external anchors, sagged inward as its own mass turned traitor. The stone around it howled, dragged inward. The mantle beneath bulged up, then was yanked down. The reliquary collapsed into itself. From within, it would have seemed like being pulled through the eye of a needle. From without, it manifested as a sudden, impossible absence at the chamber's center. Light folded in, then vanished. For a heartbeat, there was a point, no larger than a man's head, where everything that had been in that space existed at once. Then even that went away. What remained behind was not a crater, not a neat, empty chamber. It was nothing. A volume of null so absolute that even the warp shied from it. Matter that touched its edge simply ceased to be, unmade without trace. The edges of that nothing were not clean. They fizzed and snapped as reality fought to seal itself. The emergency systems of the charges, built into their designs by minds who had thought a very long time about such. Things engaged, containing the null field, forcing it to contract. In time, it did. The abscess shrank, drawing in chunks of stone, fragments of fallen traitors, splinters of old imperial work. It consumed a portion of Valith's mantle along the way, dragging superheated rock into its shrinking maw. Then, with a sound like a jaw snapping shut, it vanished entirely, leaving behind only a fine dust that did not behave as dust should, falling slower than gravity decreed, settling in patterns that refused to remain fixed. The reliquary was gone. On the surface, the destruction rode up through the world. The sudden removal of that much mass, the distortion of the mantle, sent shockwaves racing through Valith's crust. Hives that had already been weakened by bombardment and internal sabotage now faced stresses far beyond their design. Foundations cracked, support pylons sheared. Whole sections of hive stacks folded in on themselves like rotten trees, buckling and toppling. Mountains split along old fault lines, their peaks shattering and sliding down in roaring avalanches that swept away what little remained of the outhive settlements. Oceans, already boiling at the edges from firestorms and reactor breaches, heaved. Great plumes of superheated steam erupted where the seafloor tore open, venting the planet's inner heat directly into the hydrosphere. In the lower hive levels, where some had thought to hide from the falling bombs and burning air, floors tilted and walls buckled. Those who had taken refuge in maintenance tunnels found those tunnels snapping shut, crushing them. Others were flung against ceilings as gravity lurched. Carcharodons' craft, already lifting, felt the tremors as turbulent buffets. Pilots compensated, engines burning hard. Some ships rode up columns of rising hot air as if surfing titanic waves. Others were forced to detour as whole spires collapsed in front of them, sending up clouds of debris that could shred hulls. "Do not tarry," Mako voxed, voice as steady as ever. "The world dies. We are done." Gunships and thunderhawks clawed their way into the upper atmosphere, engines screaming. Drop pods that had served as temporary strongpoints were left where they lay, being swallowed by collapsing ground. There was no salvage, no recovery. The sharks were leaving this sea forever. Billions died in those final convulsions. Many never saw the faces of those who had killed their world. Their last sights were of falling ceilings, rising fire, walls of water or stone. Some saw nothing at all, crushed in instants, lives snuffed between heartbeats. In orbit, the war was over. Custodes vessels held their steady positions, their scarred hulls picking up the new patterns of light from below. Carcharodons' ships formed a looser ring, some still dark from damage, others showing fresh scars along their flanks where debris had struck during ascent. On a viewing deck of the Custodes flagship, Valerian stood, with his helm off, the light of Vaelith's burning reflected in his eyes. Around him, other custodians watched in silence. The Null Maidens had withdrawn to their own compartments, their work done. Tech adepts muttered over cogitator banks, recording seismic data, mapping the spread of fire and dust. Vaelith's shrine lights were gone. Where once the hive spires had glowed with devotional beacons, now only flames burned, and even those were being swallowed by rising clouds of ash. The world's night side, when it turned into view, was a patchwork of sullen embers and black. On the Carcharodons' flagship, Charon Mako observed the same sight in a darker chamber. The hololith rendered Vaelith as a simple sphere, color-coded for habitability, target density, and structural integrity. Where once it had shown dense concentrations of life and architecture, now it displayed mostly voids and dead colors. A serf stood nearby with a slate and stylus, waiting. "Record," Mako said, eyes never leaving the hololith. Vaelith, shrine world under segmentum charter, presence of traitor legions confirmed, engagement undertaken at will of the throne. He paused, watching as another hive icon dimmed, then vanished. "Outcome," he said. "Compliance achieved. Population, none. Enemy strength, Word-bearers war host, Iron Warriors Grand Company. Status, burned from the ledger." The serf wrote, stylus scratching. Valerian, on the Custodes' deck, watched the last visible structures collapse. "Their war host is ash," one of his brothers said quietly. "For now," Valerian replied. "Warsmiths in the eye will curse this loss, and dark apostles will turn it into a hymn. They will send others elsewhere. That is their way." He let out a breath. "But here," he said, "they are finished, and what lay beneath them is gone." Behind him, deep in the ship, a Shadowkeeper's ledger was updated. A line that had once read, "Vaelith's reliquary, sealed," now bore a different word beside it. "Nullified." On the hololith, Vaelith turned, a dark, wounded ember circling a star that did not care. In the decades that followed, Vaelith existed mostly as absence. In a dim cartograph vault on a minor segmentum way station, an adept of the administratum bent over a hololithic sphere and erased a name. His hands were thin and ink-stained, his augmetic eye clicking softly as it adjusted to the glow. The world that had once borne the legend Vaelith rotated before him, wrapped in a web of old route lines and tithe notations. By decree from far above his pay grade, those notations had changed. He whispered the new designation as he inscribed it, because that was the habit of his kind, to give sound to the shifting of lines. "Shrine World Delta 7-2, he murmured, then corrected himself at the prompt flashing on his slate. "Reclassified, excommunicate, quarantine total, cause of loss, undocumented Xenos incursion, probable plague, vector, observation prohibited without senatorum seal." He pressed the stamp to the slate, watching as the machine spirit of the record took the new script, devoured the old. The name Vaelith vanished, replaced by a string of sterile identifiers, each wrapped in administrative ciphers and warning sigils. The adept shivered as the seals flared around it, little arcs of red light locking tight. He did not know that other ledgers, far from his vault, bore a different truth. He did not know that there were chains of authority in the Imperium that walked in corridors he would never even see. He only knew that another candle had gone out on his map of the stars. Far from the tidy silence of Imperial records, in the churning madness of the Immaterium, a single warpship limped through storms. It had once borne proud sigils of the word once written in Colchizian script, its hull painted in rich dark crimson, its prow crowned with a stylized eight-pointed star. Now much of that heraldry was scorched away. Armor plating hung loose in places, dangling on chains and buckled struts. The wake it left in the warp was ragged, flickering, like the bleed of a wounded predator trying to mask its trail. Within, the ship had grown quieter. The songs that had once echoed along its corridors were thin now, diminished choirs reciting litanies that faltered for lack of voices. The mortal acolytes moved like ghosts, faces pale, eyes sunken, each one carrying the weight of a dead world on his shoulders, and not yet certain whether it counted as victory or defeat. In the central chapel, beneath a ceiling painted with scenes from Lorgar's old epistles, a man knelt on the blood-slick deck. He had once been equerry to Dark Apostle Kortalek. Once, his voice had carried the cadence of his master's words to the multitudes of Vaelith. Now, one of his arms was a stump, the other bound in crude splints. His jaw had been partly replaced by an iron frame after a Custodian's. Blow had shattered it. His armor was gone. He wore a simple robe, torn and dark with dried blood. Before him, a cluster of wounded Astartes and mortal survivors knelt or sat propped against the walls, their armor battered, their weapons laid aside. Candle flames guttered in the drafts from the damaged air systems. The air tasted of smoke and old incense. The equerry raised his head. His voice, when it came, was raw, but still had the habit of oratory, still reached for rhythms. "Brothers," he said, "hear the epistle of ash." They watched him with hollow eyes. "We went to a world whose name they had forgotten," he said. "We spoke to its people. We showed them the lie of their saint, the emptiness of their corpse throne. We bled them into a pattern that woke one of the old works they had buried in fear. We made the silent places speak." He spat blood to one side, smiling through the pain. "And see what answered," he went on. "Not their god, not their shining master. Only his wardens of yesterday, golden statues that walk, pale sharks that swim through the void. They burned a world to deny us a single prayer finished." One of the wounded Astartes shifted, servos whirring softly. "They bled," the equerry said quickly, seizing on the only crumb of comfort. "The 10,000, who boast they do not die, who carve their perfection into every blow, they fell on Vaelith. We saw them break, piece by piece, under shells and melter. Every one of them cost us, aye, but they bled." He leaned forward, eyes bright now, feverish. "Remember that," he hissed. "When you hear tales of their invincibility, when the next apostles speak of their untouchable palace, remember we dragged them into the dirt of a shrine world and made them pay for every step toward their master's sins." His voice dropped. "And the sharks," he murmured. "Oh, the sharks. They do not preach, they do not talk of mercy, they do not even pretend to save. They kill worlds so their master can pretend he is clean. They are not his angels, they are his teeth." He raised his head again. "So take heart, brothers. If the corpse must send such monsters to silence a single sermon, then we have stung him. He cannot ignore us. He fears the words we speak. He fears the doors we find." He smiled, something cracked and wild in the expression. "And fear is the first prayer to the Pantheon." In the eye of terror, news traveled in ways that had little to do with sane communication. The echo of Vaelith's death reached the demon worlds as a rumor carried by possessed machine spirits and half-coherent astropathic screams. It came in the tales of scavenger captains who had skirted the edge of the Segmentum Obscurus and seen a star that now had one less world circling it. On the obsidian battlements of an iron citadel that clung to an asteroid the size of a continent, a warsmith listened. His armor bore the marks of the Fourth Legion, his sigils those of a different grand company than the one that had died beneath Valith's sky. He sat on a throne made of broken siege engines, his servo arms folded around him like the limbs of a resting spider, while his lieutenants argued below. Damakos took a bold prize, one snarled. The reliquary was worth 1,000 worlds. To have woken it, to have twisted it, that might have given us a road straight into the corpse's walled heart. And he lost everything, another countered. Bastions, ships, a whole battle wrought over centuries, burned. The Golden Ones do not usually bestir themselves for such crusades. They did for this. That should tell you something. They bled, a third put in. Reports say their auramite fell in the tunnels. Their precious shadowkeepers spent their gold like any other currency. That knowledge has its own price. The warsmith on the throne raised a hand, and the argument stilled. The calculus is simple, he said. We gained nothing tangible, no weapon, no path, only a dead world we cannot easily use. We lost a grand company and the works it had wrought. The corpse and his lapdogs lost ships and some of their vaunted guardians. He paused, considering. Do they bleed? He said. Yes, they always have. Have we broken them? No. Their palace still stands. Their golden killers still walk. The sharks still swim. He leaned back, helm lenses glinting. Take from Valith this lesson, he said. The Emperor still fears his own past. He will burn a world rather than risk us touching it. That fear is a weapon. One day, we will wield it better than Damakos did. On Terra, beneath the palace that had birthed those golden killers, the truth of Valith was written in a room that saw very little sunlight. The vault's walls were lined with shelves carved from bedrock. Upon them rested books and data slates, scrolls and adamantine tablets, each bearing records too, dangerous to be given to the wind of common administratum archives. The air smelled of oil and dust and old wax. A shadowkeeper tribune stood before a lectern of black stone, a quill of metal in his crimson-gloved hand. Before him lay a ledger, bound in human hide, and sealed with keys that only the 10,000 could turn. Its pages were dense with script in an archaic hand, entries marching down like the steps of a long stair. He turned to one near the middle. Valith's Reliquary, the entry read, in a style of high Gothic seldom seen outside these walls. Beneath the title, a short description noted its nature as a throne-adjacent construct. Status lines followed, sealed. Warnings had been inscribed below the word in smaller script, each a note regarding the conditions under which the seal might fail. Those words were now crossed through, black lines seared into the parchment. In their place, a single new word was written, nullified. The tribune's quill left a faint trail of scorch marks as it moved, the ink carrying a charge that burned into the page. Around the word, the older sigils that had glowed whenever someone with the wrong gene code came near now lay dark, their power spent. He closed the book with care. Elsewhere in the palace, a Castian Valerian knelt before an audience that no longer had a face. The chamber was lit by a single, distant source, a pale radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The floor was polished stone, veined with gold sigils so fine they could barely be seen from a pace away. The walls were lost in shadow. At the far end, upon a dais that might have held a throne once, and now held only empty space, shapes moved within the gloom. Valerian reported. He spoke of Valith's awakening, of the Word-Bearer's ritual and the Iron Warrior's fortress works, of the Void War, the Spearhead descent, the battle at the gate. He spoke of Damakos Brak's death, of Kortalek's final silence beneath a pariah's gaze. He described the construct he had seen, in words stripped of embellishment, leaving only the facts. He named the custodians who had fallen, each title and appellation spoken without apology, without softening. The dead were not hidden. They were acknowledged. Finally, he spoke of the Carcharodons. He described their brutality without judgment, as one might describe a storm. The vented hives, the rad-soaked trenches, the virus shells, the way they left no room for survivors to seed new cults. His words did not praise, but they did not condemn. Silence greeted him at the end, broken only by the faint sigh of mechanisms hidden deep in the chamber's bones. When the reply came, it was in the measured tones of a senatorum voice, filtered through hidden vox grills, its owner unseen. "The reliquary is gone," it said. "The traitor war host there is ash. The world is no longer a point of access. The price is acceptable." Another voice, colder, spoke with the inflection of a shadow keeper. "The sharks performed as intended," it said. "They remain useful. They remain dangerous. They require watching." Valerian bowed his head. "We will remember Velith," he said simply. That, more than any cartograph seal, was the true marker of a world's passing. On the Carcharodons' flagship, the strategium was dim. Hololiths cast muted light over the gathered captains, rendering their features in shades of green and shadow. In the center of the chamber, two images hung side by side. On the left, Velith before, shrine cities wreathed in gentle lumens, hive spires gleaming, seas dark but intact, pilgrim fleets moving in slow orbits, tiny motes of light. On the right, Velith after, a cracked cinder, atmosphere thinned and choked with dust, hives flattened or shattered, no visible signs of life, no ships. Karen Mako stood between the two projections, helm in the crook of his arm, the scars on his pale scalp catching the light. He regarded the images for a long while. "They built their faith upon it," he said at last, voice low. "Shrines on shrines, prayers on prayers. They forgot the first purpose beneath the stone and wrote over it with their own." He gestured, a short, sharp cut of his hand. "Now it is quiet." A serf ready with slate and stylus waited at his elbow. "Log the war for Velith," Mako said. "Segmentum obscurus shrine world. Presence of traitor legions verified. Mission parameter, denial of asset to enemy. Outcome, compliance achieved. Population, none." The serf wrote, hand shaking slightly as he put the words into the chapter's permanent record. In time, the slate would be transcribed into bone, then into memory. The details would blur, the line would remain. In the lower decks of that same vessel, a man scrubbed dried blood from the plating and tried not to think. He had once been Yasin, scribist of High Velith Primus. His name was not used now. He was a serf, a figure in a faded grey overall with a collar at his neck, his old ink stains washed away in a dozen baths of harsh solvent. He moved with a dozen other men down a corridor lined with chains and weapon racks, stiff brushes in their hands, cleaning the last traces of Velith from the ship. Every now and then, a Carcharodon would pass. They moved through the corridors in 2 and 3s, armor still showing the soot and scars of the world they had left behind. They paid the serfs no more mind than they did the walls. When their boots passed, the deck vibrated. When their helms turned, the red of their lenses slid over the mortals like weapon sights. Jason kept his eyes down, but his mind could not help replaying images. Word-bearers in crimson, preaching with their throats full of warped light. Iron warriors standing in their trenches, guns never wavering even as fire came down from above. Both had spoken, in their ways, of gods that would reward loyalty and punish betrayal. Then had come the golden giants and the grey. The golden ones had been worse in some ways. They had not preached at all. They had simply walked through walls of fire, and piled corpses behind them where their spears passed. They had looked at everything, cultist or citizen, with the same flat assessment. Worth killing, not worth killing yet. The grey ones had laughed even less. To Jason now, there was very little difference between the gods the word-bearers had promised and the beings who served the Emperor. Both demanded surrender. Both turned worlds into script for their wills. Both burned those scripts when they were finished reading. The only choice, he thought, scrubbing at a smear that might once have been a man he knew, was whose ledger you ended up in. Few ever realized they had had a choice at all. On Terra, in a vault deeper even than the Shadowkeeper's ledger hall, Valerian walked alone. The air was cold here, in the way of places that had never known sunlight. The walls were bare rock, smoothed but unadorned. The only furnishings were a series of stasis plinths and sealed pylons, each bearing its own warding sigils, each humming faintly with restrained power. He moved between them like a man walking a gallery of old sins. Some of the devices resembled the core he had seen under Valith, in the way that a sketch resembles a finished portrait. Others were different shapes entirely, spheres of obsidian caged in gold, coils of crystal tubing filled with slow, luminous fluid, dull metal cubes that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Each bore a sigil keyed to the 10,000. Each had an entry in the ledger above. Some had been marked as sealed, dormant, untroubled. A few had been marked more recently with the same word that now lay beside Valith, nullified. Valerian stopped before one plinth whose wards were older than the palace itself. The device upon it was small, barely the size of a man's skull, its surface a maze of lines and nodes. Warnings packed its surrounding ward frame, inscribed in a dozen ancient tongues. The Emperor had touched this once. So had others. So now had the Shadowkeepers who walked in their wake. How many, Valerian wondered aloud, his voice flat in the stone, would wake if no one watched? There was no answer, of course, only the hum of restrained energies. He thought of Valith's construct, gone now, and of the thread of null ash left in its place. He thought of the sharks who had burned the world around it, and of the scribist whose name he would never know, whose last thoughts had been of giants and fire. "We are not guardians of life," he said quietly, to the plinths and the shadows. "We are curators of what our master allows to exist." It was not pride. It was not self-reproach. It was a statement of function. In another part of the galaxy, on the limping word-bearer warp ship, the former equerry concluded his own sermon. In the end, he told his haggard audience, it was not their love for the corpse that drove them. It was fear of what lay under his own hand. They burned a planet to keep his secrets. They killed legions and billions for a single vault. Remember that, when you kneel. Remember who truly rules this age of ending. In time, his words would be carried to other dark chapels, twisted and retold, becoming another layer of myth in a galaxy already thick with them. Perhaps, somewhere else, a dry-voiced imperial historian would set quill to parchment and pen a more measured account, devoid of passion. He would write of station designations and fleet movements, of casualty estimates and the technical specifications of the devices used to erase Valith's core. He would note, with all the intensity of a man cataloguing shells on a shore, that the Adeptus Custodes and the Adeptus Astartes had intervened directly, and that the world had not survived their attention. He might even, if he were very honest and very careful, write the truth in a margin no one was meant to read, that the Golden Wardens and the Void Sharks were not shepherds, that they did not come to defend the weak or to preserve the innocent. They came when the ledger demanded a line to be drawn and a thing to be ended. They were not guardians of humanity so much as archivists of what might be allowed to linger under the shadow of the throne. In the cold dark, Vailith turned. Once, its hives had sent litanies up like incense, their lights a faint, steady glow against the star behind them. Now, there were no lights, no voices, only a scarred, airless cinder circling a sun that noticed nothing of its loss. Its orbit was tracked in a handful of places, in the secret vaults of terror, in the log scripts of the Carcharodons, tucked between other dead worlds, in the murmured tales of word-bearers and iron warriors who spoke of a shrine burned to silence. To most of the Imperium, it was a mark on an old chart, a warning rune that meant nothing to men who would never go that way. Those who remembered knew that once, on its surface, the Emperor's will had been enforced by golden giants and pale killers, and that legions and worlds alike had been fed into the fire to protect a single buried work. The ash of that sermon drifted on in the warp and the dark, waiting for other ears, other wars,